The shadow of the truth of school. Everything began when rumors spread across the school about a series of students mysteriously disappearing. The administration remained silent, with no official statements, but whispers filled the hallways. Lena was a quiet, diligent student who often immersed herself in schoolwork. She loved solving puzzles, seeking answers to difficult questions, and spending hours reading books. Some people said the students had run away. Others believed something darker was happening. Lena noticed the growing number of empty seats in her class, the somber faces of teachers, and the whispered conversations among students created a heavy atmosphere, and a sense of unease loomed over the school. Lena, always logical, dismissed the idea of anything supernatural or strange. But when Anna, a classmate she'd known for years, vanished without a trace, Lena became increasingly curious. Anna was supposed to meet Lena at the library, but she never showed up. The next day, Lena discovered Anna had joined the list of missing students with no explanation. She started piecing together the timeline of the disappearances, observing the dates and times when students went missing. It was always the same. They disappeared after a specific time, during the late hours of night school, after extracurricular activities had ended. Lena's curiosity led her to the school library, where she found old newspapers describing similar cases from years ago. She discovered an old yearbook featuring photos of students who had been part of a club years ago. Strangely, many of those photos were now listed as missing in old newspaper articles. One evening, as she stayed late studying, she heard faint noises from the hallway. Curious, she peeked outside and saw a woman with long blonde hair running past. Strangely, she didn't recognize the woman, and the timing seemed odd for someone to be running around the school building. Curious and uneasy, Lena decided to follow her. She trailed the blonde woman through the dark hallways of the school, staying out of sight. The woman's behavior was erratic. She seemed scared and confused, as if fleeing from something. The woman ran toward a man. He was tall and well-dressed, but something about her demeanor compelled Lena to follow. It was unusual, almost fearful. Lena decided to follow the man. She watched them leave the building, heading toward a secluded area near the school. The two entered an abandoned building, and for a moment, Lena hesitated. She followed them into the eerie darkness of the building, but just as she was about to step inside, she heard the woman's scream echoing through the night. Lena froze in place. It was too late to turn back. She cautiously stepped into the dark hallway of the building, the cries from afar growing louder. She moved toward a faint light at the end of the hallway, emanating from a slightly ajar room. As Lena approached, she could see photos on the walls, featuring blonde-haired girls. The names of the girls were written beneath their photos, but one name made her freeze in her tracks: Anna. She was stunned to see her own photo, following that of the girl she had just seen. Lena scanned the room and saw two blonde-haired girls, and to her horror, one of them was Anna. Both girls were emaciated, their hair crudely chopped. And then, he began to approach. Lena quickly backed away as she heard the man's voice. Anna's voice echoed in the room.
"Jack, please forgive me,"
she pleaded, her voice trembling with fear. Lena suddenly realized that this Jack was far from ordinary, and he was not someone she should confront. She needed to stay calm and avoid drawing attention. She decided to quietly leave. She left the abandoned building, found a safe spot, and quietly called the police. In the end, the truth came to light, and Jack was arrested. Investigations revealed that Jack had a troubled past. He was once a boy who was rejected by a blonde girl he loved. Jack was an unassuming, chubby boy with an unremarkable appearance. He confessed his love to a blonde girl, but she mocked him as fat in front of everyone and rejected his feelings. After years of bullying and humiliation, especially that public rejection, his anger grew. His hatred festered, And now, whenever he saw blonde-haired girls, he loathed them, regardless of who they were. He imprisoned them, cut their hair, and starved them into frailty. Lena felt fortunate to have uncovered the truth early and lucky that she was not the next victim, along with those who came after. The shadow of the truth of school. Everything began when rumors spread across the school about a series of students mysteriously disappearing. The administration remained silent, with no official statements, but whispers filled the hallways. Lena was a quiet, diligent student who often immersed herself in schoolwork. She loved solving puzzles, seeking answers to difficult questions, and spending hours reading books. Some people said the students had run away. Others believed something darker was happening. Lena noticed the growing number of empty seats in her class, the somber faces of teachers, and the whispered conversations among students created a heavy atmosphere, and a sense of unease loomed over the school. Lena, always logical, dismissed the idea of anything supernatural or strange. But when Anna, a classmate she'd known for years, vanished without a trace, Lena became increasingly curious. Anna was supposed to meet Lena at the library, but she never showed up. The next day, Lena discovered Anna had joined the list of missing students with no explanation. She started piecing together the timeline of the disappearances, observing the dates and times when students went missing. It was always the same. They disappeared after a specific time, during the late hours of night school, after extracurricular activities had ended. Lena's curiosity led her to the school library, where she found old newspapers describing similar cases from years ago. She discovered an old yearbook featuring photos of students who had been part of a club years ago. Strangely, many of those photos were now listed as missing in old newspaper articles. One evening, as she stayed late studying, she heard faint noises from the hallway. Curious, she peeked outside and saw a woman with long blonde hair running past. Strangely, she didn't recognize the woman, and the timing seemed odd for someone to be running around the school building. Curious and uneasy, Lena decided to follow her. She trailed the blonde woman through the dark hallways of the school, staying out of sight. The woman's behavior was erratic. She seemed scared and confused, as if fleeing from something. The woman ran toward a man. He was tall and well-dressed, but something about her demeanor compelled Lena to follow. It was unusual, almost fearful. Lena decided to follow the man. She watched them leave the building, heading toward a secluded area near the school. The two entered an abandoned building, and for a moment, Lena hesitated. She followed them into the eerie darkness of the building, but just as she was about to step inside, she heard the woman's scream echoing through the night. Lena froze in place. It was too late to turn back. She cautiously stepped into the dark hallway of the building, the cries from afar growing louder. She moved toward a faint light at the end of the hallway, emanating from a slightly ajar room. As Lena approached, she could see photos on the walls, featuring blonde-haired girls. The names of the girls were written beneath their photos, but one name made her freeze in her tracks: Anna. She was stunned to see her own photo, following that of the girl she had just seen. Lena scanned the room and saw two blonde-haired girls, and to her horror, one of them was Anna. Both girls were emaciated, their hair crudely chopped. And then, he began to approach. Lena quickly backed away as she heard the man's voice. Anna's voice echoed in the room.
Jack, please forgive me,
she pleaded, her voice trembling with fear. Lena suddenly realized that this Jack was far from ordinary, and he was not someone she should confront. She needed to stay calm and avoid drawing attention. She decided to quietly leave. She left the abandoned building, found a safe spot, and quietly called the police. In the end, the truth came to light, and Jack was arrested. Investigations revealed that Jack had a troubled past. He was once a boy who was rejected by a blonde girl he loved. Jack was an unassuming, chubby boy with an unremarkable appearance. He confessed his love to a blonde girl, but she mocked him as fat in front of everyone and rejected his feelings. After years of bullying and humiliation, especially that public rejection, his anger grew. His hatred festered, and now, whenever he saw blonde-haired girls, he loathed them, regardless of who they were. He imprisoned them, cut their hair, and starved them into frailty. Lena felt fortunate to have uncovered the truth early and lucky that she was not the next victim, along with those who came after. Ghost in the gym. A violent storm raged outside, the rain pattering against the windows of the gym. Today, Nana arrived earlier than usual to prepare for the upcoming exam, hurrying toward the gym. Her gym teacher greeted each student outside the girls' locker room. As usual, Nana entered the locker room, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly due to the storm. She walked to her locker and took out her workout clothes. As she began preparing her things, a faint shadow caught her eye, gliding along the other side of the lockers. She paused, glancing around. Curiosity overcame her, and she called out, "Is anyone there?" Nana walked toward the source of the noise, which was at the end of the locker room, where a row of shower stalls stood, the last stall covered by a thick, dark curtain. Nana approached, the lights beginning to flicker erratically. Not knowing where she found the courage, she reached out and pulled back the closed curtain, revealing only an empty shower stall. She was about to turn away when she sensed someone passing right behind her. She froze for a moment, then a sound like soft sobbing echoed back, sending chills down her spine. The temperature suddenly dropped, a chill enveloping her. At that moment, the voices of other girls echoed in from the hallway. Nana temporarily felt relieved as she stepped out of the shower area and saw a group of students walking by. She asked if they heard someone crying, but the girls exchanged puzzled glances and shook their heads. She returned to the gym class, where everyone was gathered. Suddenly, a terrified scream echoed throughout the gym. A fellow student named Lee ran in, her face pale and filled with fear. She collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. The gym class fell silent as everyone stared in horror, confused and frightened. As the teacher pressed Lee to explain, she trembled, describing a horrifying scene she told of a baby, covered in blood, appearing in the bathroom and standing there crying. After class, Nana decided to stay behind for extra practice. She walked alone to the entrance when she suddenly noticed a key lying on the floor and the gym door ajar. A dark sense of unease washed over her as Nana stepped into the dimly lit room. She tried to turn on the lights, but they seemed to be out of order. Determined to push past her fear, Nana decided to prepare for the upcoming swimming exam. She walked to the pool area, the dim lights reflecting off the water. As she approached the pool, she heard a nearby sobbing voice, that of a girl, weak and sorrowful. Nana stopped, looking around the area, but saw no one, and everything fell silent. The overhead lights flickered, distorting her vision for a moment. As she squinted, she saw a shadow floating at the far end of the pool. Her first thought was that it was a student practicing diving, as that occasionally happened. But as time passed, she realized that the shadow wasn't moving. A sense of unease welled up inside her, and she decided to check, just to be sure. Nana approached the edge of the pool, her eyes fixed on the floating shadow. As she got closer, fear surged within her. The water around the shadow began to darken, turning a deep crimson, and she realized with horror that a lifeless body was floating in the pool. Overcome with fear, Nana ran to seek help. Moments later, the police arrived to investigate. They confirmed that the body belonged to a student who had been seen alive just a day before. Nana suddenly realized it was Lee. Her mind was haunted by memories of her friend. She learned that her friend had been haunted by strange visions, driven mad by sounds and sights that no one else could perceive. Lee could not stand the pressure from many sides. It caused her to develop depression and pushed her to the brink. Nana stood at the school gate, watching the flickering lights of police cars fade into the distance. The storm had passed, but a chilling emptiness lingered in the air. She shuddered, haunted by thoughts of the ghostly figure and the cries she had heard. In the following days, Nana lay in bed, tossing and turning as she recalled haunting images. The pale face of her friend Lee, the bloodied child, and the dark water lingered ominously in her mind. In her sleep, the voices of Lee echoed in her ears, pleading, desperate, and faint. With each passing day, they grew louder, resonating in her mind. The next morning, Nana walked through the school hallway, the world around her feeling dreamlike. She paused in front of the gym, staring at the closed doors before walking away. That night, Nana fell asleep. As she closed her eyes, she was pulled into another nightmare. She stood in the gym, surrounded by darkness. Lee's face appeared before her, eyes wide with fear as she reached out, as if wanting to say something. Then everything seemed to change. The water in the pool turned red, and she watched in horror as Lee emerged from beneath the surface, slowly rising as if trapped. Nana tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The next day, Nana's nightmare still haunted her thoughts. Each day was filled with a nagging feeling that she was overlooking something urgent, something dark that only she could confront. She knew she needed to understand what had happened to Lee to help her find peace. Nana dove into research, sifting through old-school records, searching for any information about unexplained incidents at the gym or pool. After hours of digging, she stumbled upon a small article about a tragic incident, the unsolved death of a young girl at the school many years ago. The report detailed how a female student mysteriously drowned in the pool, and witnesses claimed to have seen a crying child nearby, although no child was ever found. Through the faded articles and forgotten records, she discovered that a child had been abandoned at the school. The child had died under tragic circumstances, perhaps explaining why the girl's spirit wandered, trapped here. The more she read, the more Nana understood the connection. The spirit of the abandoned child, full of pain and loneliness, had latched onto isolated students. Lee had been haunted by this spirit, drawn in by her own sorrow. That night, Nana returned to the pool one last time, determined to confront the spirit and free her friend. The water's surface was unusually still, almost holding its breath. A figure slowly emerged from the darkness, the ghostly form of a child, her wet hair hanging in tangled strands around her pale, hollow face. The child's eyes were dark and empty, locking onto Nana with a sharp, calculating gaze, as if probing her intentions. Nana opened her mouth to speak, her voice trembling, but the child moved closer. Suddenly, the child's face twisted, her mouth stretching into a cruel smile. She reached out with her bony, skeletal hand, extending sharp fingers towards Nana like claws. Nana stepped back, fear rising in her stomach, but she held her ground. She could only follow her heart, her voice trembling as she said, "Please, I want to help you." To the child's spirit, the child's smile faded, her expression stiffening, as if she had heard these words before, words that ended in betrayal. The child's empty eyes narrowed, and she lunged forward, her hands clawing at Nana's throat. Nana stumbled back, but she stood her ground, raising her hands in a gesture of surrender. "I don't want to hurt you. I understand your pain. The child paused, her arms falling to her sides, confusion evident on her face. But then her expression twisted again, suspicion flickering across her features, as if she were battling memories of her own pain and betrayal. In desperation, Nana moved closer, her hand shaking but steady as she extended it. The child hesitated, her appearance wavering between anger and sadness, her expression softening as Nana's words seemed to touch something deep inside. For the first time, the child's expression softened into one of almost peacefulness, her anger dissipating as she released her grip, her form fading into a gentle light. After all, there was one more thing Nana had to do. In her dream, she remembered something that Lee had conveyed to her. Nana recalled being led by Lee to a forgotten corner of the locker room, where an old art portfolio lay hidden beneath a pile of sports equipment, covered in dust. When she was alive, whenever under pressure, Lee would paint vibrant children's paintings, cheerful expressions, and serene landscapes. Each painting was filled with warmth, completely contrasting the darkness that enveloped Lee in her final days. The following weekend, Nana went to the local orphanage, clutching the portfolio to her chest. She handed it to the director of the orphanage, explaining Lee's wishes. As she had promised, Nana had painted and written about their story to memorialize them, ensuring that no one would forget them. Nana returns to school. She reflects on her journey. The remaining echoes of the past have faded, replaced by a feeling of fulfillment. She has somehow helped bring peace to suffering souls. Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is quite fitting for someone who enjoys solitude. Just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we divide the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this 1,000 times, but something about this night felt different, as though something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and kept cleaning. I put on headphones, playing music low enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I returned, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had placed earlier had fallen over. I sighed and stepped forward to pick it up, but that's when I saw them. Small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints, which led to the staircase heading up to the second floor. I stopped, trying to listen for any sound. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flicker of motion at the end of the hallway. I rushed to the end of the hallway, but no one was there. At that moment, I heard faint laughter, the giggling of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending a chill down my spine. I turned, searching for the source, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket had been tipped over, spilling water into a large puddle. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I tried to figure out what was happening. Were there students still in the building? Had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was joking with her. She looked at me, completely puzzled, shaking her head. I've been here the whole time. I couldn't make sense of it. I left her workspace and went back to finish my shift. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It felt like the entire building had turned into a horror movie set. I knew where the electrical room was, so I decided to head there. But before I could reach it, I heard a scream, my coworker's scream, echoing through the school, filled with terror. I ran toward the electrical room, fear welling up inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. When I pushed the door open, I expected to see my coworker inside. Instead, there was a figure standing in the dark. I couldn't tell who it was, but something about it felt off. The figure moved closer. Before I could pull out my phone, it lunged forward and slammed the door shut in my face. Panicked, the first ran away. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was nowhere to be found. I called out her name, but there was no response. The only sound was faint laughter, echoing again through the empty hallway. The whispers made me freeze. I turned quickly, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I moved slowly and cautiously. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. I headed up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. When I reached the hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, had returned. I stared at the small, damp prints, which seemed to be heading toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. That's when I saw the blackboard. Scrawled in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." Had someone come in here? But I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The handle twisted violently, shaking as though someone, or something, was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The pounding on the door stopped. I slowly crept toward it and pressed my ear against it. But there was nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as possible. I cracked the door open slightly and peered into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, scanning for any signs of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. As I walked down, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly visible in the red light. As I got closer, I saw a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a tattered school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The child didn't respond. I took another step forward, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. Then the child turned around, a horrifying mask, pale and soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, toothy grin aimed at me. The child let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the stairwell, a shrill, piercing sound that felt like it was ripping through my skull. I staggered backward, dropping the mop. I ran as fast as I could down the hallway. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed endlessly long in a horrifying way. I burst through the door into the gym. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body trembling with fear. The footsteps stopped. The door remained shut. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the far corner of the gym, I heard it, a basketball bouncing. There, in the far corner, the child still stood, his face twisted into that eerie grin, holding a basketball and bouncing it slowly. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing through the empty gym. I stepped back, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as though he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted outside, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted smile. I hit the gas and sped out of the parking lot. The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't return to the school the next night. I never went back there again. Abandoned house invaded. Behind my house, there is a large but old and decaying building. It no longer resembles a home. It now looks more like an abandoned house. It has been vacant for decades, or so my parents said. But every time I passed by, I would unmistakably hear the sound of electricity crackling from inside. It made no sense. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Finally, one day I decided to investigate. I asked my friend Tim to come with me after school. He agreed, though we both felt a tense, underlying dread as we stood in front of the house, a bad premonition hanging in the air. As soon as we pushed the door open, it creaked on its rusty hinges, filling the silence. Inside, the air was thick with an unbearable stench, a mix of mold and rot. Scattered across the floor were piles of old dog food, and the foul odor hit us in waves. We carefully stepped through the strange debris and noticed something odd. The floor was littered with nails, hundreds of them, along with animal traps, as if someone had deliberately tried to prevent people from walking through the house. We tiptoed through, avoiding the nails, our curiosity growing stronger with each step. Then we heard the sound of an electric charge, followed by a scream of pain from upstairs. It sent a shiver down my spine. We should have turned back, but our curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to climb the stairs. On the second floor, the noise led us to a closed door. From behind it, we heard a man's voice muttering something strange, as if giving commands. What was happening on the other side? Summoning our last bit of courage, we tiptoed up the stairs and peeked inside. The sight was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. It looked like someone had been chained up. Two people sat on the floor, appearing to be a couple who had been captured and imprisoned. Their eyes were wide open, filled with terror. A man stood before them, holding a stun gun, threatening them to follow his commands. For a moment, the room fell silent as the two people stared at us in disbelief. Their eyes pleaded for help, silently begging for mercy. Then their voices broke with desperation, sobbing and pleading not to be harmed. The man panicked, shouting at them to be quiet while violently beating them with the stun gun. But they continued screaming, their cries echoing through every corner of the room. Tim froze, paralyzed with fear, and accidentally knocked over a piece of wood, creating a loud noise. That was when the man noticed us. The man turned toward us, his eyes filled with rage. Without hesitation, he grabbed the stun gun and charged at us. We bolted down the stairs, but Tim wasn't fast enough. His screams echoed down the hallway as I heard the crackling of the stun gun. I didn't stop running until I was outside, my heart pounding in my chest. I called the police, barely able to get the words out, but I knew I couldn't leave Tim behind. I ran back into the house, trying to stay as quiet as possible, recalling the self-defense lessons I had learned at school. The door to the room was still open, and I peeked in. My blood ran cold. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The man was putting a collar around Tim's neck, his hands already bound tightly. I couldn't just stand there and watch my friend and these innocent people suffer like this. Rage surged through me, and I charged at the man, kicking him with all the strength I had. He staggered and fell, dropping the stun gun. I grabbed it, threatening him. Moments later, the police arrived and pulled me away from him. As the police began to untie the captives, they discovered something even more horrifying. Their feet had been glued to the floor with industrial adhesive. I was horrified that the man had gone to such lengths. Finally, the rescue team arrived, and the hostages were freed, though their condition was dire. They had been beaten, starved, and fed animal food. When the police interrogated the man, his chilling response was that he wanted to keep humans as pets. In the end, he was arrested and taken to prison. None of us ever spoke about that day again. This is a warning from what I witnessed. If you ever come across an abandoned house, no matter how strong your urge to explore, resist it. Stay away, because no one can guarantee you will make it out alive. The Ghostly Tome. An old library stood at the edge of town, a structure with stone walls darkened by centuries of weather. Ivy covered the walls, and narrow arched windows allowed only the faintest. This was where Clara worked as the head librarian, a job she had cherished for over a decade. She always found solace in the silence, the smell of old books. But something had changed. Clara arrived early and approached the heavy wooden door. As she unlocked it, a shiver came over her, a feeling she had been experiencing more often lately. She took it as the cold of the morning and went inside. The library was still and silent, as usual at this hour. Clara moved through the familiar aisles, her footsteps echoing softly. She followed her routine, checking book returns and organizing new arrivals. The building's silence was comforting, yet today it felt oppressive, almost watchful. She made her way to the basement, where the rare and old books were stored. It was her favorite part of the library, but for some reason, they were often not taken out for reading. The basement was the coldest part of the library, and as Clara descended the creaky wooden stairs, she felt a growing sense of unease. The basement was dimly lit, the only light coming from a few flickering bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Shadows danced across the walls, and the musty smell of old paper was stronger here. She was searching for a book that a researcher had requested from her library. As she searched, she heard a faint rustling sound behind her. She quickly turned around, but saw nothing. She told herself it was just a rat. Clara continued her search. Finally, she found the book she was looking for, an old leather-bound tome with faded gold lettering. As she pulled it from the shelf, she felt a sudden, icy breeze brush past her. The lights flickered, and she heard the rustling again, louder this time, as if something was moving through the stacks. Clara's hands trembled as she clutched the book to her chest. She decided it was time to leave the basement. As she turned to go, she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. A shadow, darker than the others, passed between the bookshelves. She stiffened, her breath caught in her throat. A shadow that had the vague shape of a human being. The shadow stopped, forming a vaguely human-like shape that seemed to be looking straight at her, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. She stumbled up the stairs, nearly dropping the book in her haste. Panic struck. Clara struggled to find the flashlight, but her hands were shaking so much that she couldn't turn it on. The rustling sound grew louder, closer, until she felt it right next to her. Clara felt something cold and wet touch her arm, and she screamed. At that moment, she dropped the book, revealing pages filled with strange, unfamiliar symbols. reluctantly took the book back, feeling an inexplicable pull to take it with me. In the darkness, as she brought the book upstairs, Clara could feel its presence. It seemed to seep into her mind, filling her with fear. As she neared the basement door slammed shut behind her with a deafening noise. The library above seemed unchanged, still and silent, but the claustrophobic feeling remained. Back in the main lobby, Clara sat at her desk, a mysterious book in front of her. She placed the book on the table and took a breath, then stared at it with both fear and curiosity. She started to wonder whether she should open it or not, but then she curiously opened it to examine the symbols, flipping through each page, brittle with age. The symbols seemed to shift and change, almost as if they were alive. She shook her head, blaming her imagination. And thinking she was being paranoid. Darkness filled the library. She suddenly read a passage out loud. Suddenly, the whispering became louder. The lights flickered violently, then went out completely. Clara's breathing became rapid. She tried to ignore it, closed the book immediately, and decided to put it back in its place. The library was silent and dark. Clara, she doesn't know if she's in her imagination, or if something is residing in this library, or if there are hidden secrets that she doesn't know yet. Morning light cast long shadows through narrow windows. Clara stood outside, hesitating to enter. She gathered her courage, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. Clara slowly walked toward her desk, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. As she passed by, she glimpsed the old book she had stored in the basement yesterday lying on her desk. Clara was horrified. She was certain she'd put it back on the shelf in the basement. Clara stared at the book, hesitated for a moment, then grabbed it, deciding to destroy it in hopes of freeing herself from this fear. She walked toward the old fireplace at the far end of the library, gripping the book tightly. She opened it, and the symbols writhed as if alive, almost resisting her. She threw the book into the flames. A hissing sound escaped from the book. The fire abruptly went out, extinguished, leaving the book charred but still intact. Clara stared at the ancient book, desperate. She raised the book to throw it into the trash. But as she swung her arm, an invisible force pulled it from her hand. The book flew across the room, hovering mid-air. Then it started flying back, hurtling toward her with fierce speed. It slammed into her chest, knocking the wind out of her in pain. She gasped, stumbling backward, clutching her aching ribs. She held her breath, watching the book fall to the floor, its pages flapping wildly. Clara's hands trembled as she picked up the book again, and from the corner of her eye, she sensed someone standing and watching her. At that moment, everything seemed to go dark. Turning slowly, she found herself face to face with a shadowy figure from her nightmares. She lifted her phone flashlight to see. The figure moved slowly into the faint light, revealing the distorted, grotesque shape of a woman. Her skin was pale, stretched tightly over sharp, angular bones. Her face was gaunt, with only skeletal features. Her mouth twisted into a crooked smile, revealing jagged, decayed teeth. Her eyes were black, hollow, and lifeless. Clara stumbled backward, her flashlight slipping from her hand. The grotesque woman moved closer, her jerky movements almost puppet-like. Then, in the blink of an eye, it lunged toward her, its twisted, skeletal hand stretching out, distorting as it reached for her. Its claw-like fingers scratched across Clara's face, as if devouring a meal. Clara raised the book defensively, trying to fend it off, but the spirit lunged at her again. With its unnaturally elongated arm, it grabbed her shoulder once again, pulling her closer. Pain tore through her, as if her skin was being ripped apart. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The woman's face came closer, her distorted smile stretching impossibly wide, revealing layers of rotting flesh inside her mouth. She stared into the ghost's endless, empty black eyes. The book slipped from her hand. The book's pages began to flip wildly, symbols blazing with dark energy, as if absorbing the terror flooding the room. In a final attempt to escape, Clara crawled backward, away from it, but it floated after her, laughing loudly, piercingly. Clara's vision dimmed as her strength drained away, her body paralyzed, her mind succumbing to the encroaching darkness. The library stood eerily silent, pale light cast on the dark stone walls. Villagers gathered, whispering to each other as they noticed Clara's absence. The library doors remained shut, and though a few dared to peer through the windows, they saw only empty, silent rooms with no sign of Clara. The whispers lingered, awaiting the next unfortunate soul to uncover the library's secrets. Hide and seek in an abandoned house. Today, I decided to ignore my parents' warnings and meet up with my friends to play hide and seek in the old abandoned house near the woods. I remember everything clearly: the musty air, the creaking floors, and the thrill that washed over me as we sneaked into the dilapidated building. Jack, Rian, Lexi, and I. We loved adventure and the adrenaline rush, but nothing could compare to the mystery of that house. The house was surrounded by barbed wire, with the gate tightly locked, but we found a small hole in the wall, hidden behind overgrown grass, just big enough for us to crawl through one by one. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt something was off, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. We decided to play hide and seek. It was my turn to seek, so I closed my eyes and started counting. The others scattered throughout the house, laughing, their footsteps echoing through the empty rooms.
98, 99, 100.
I opened my eyes and immediately went searching for my friends. It didn't take long to find Lexi and Rian, but Jack was different. He was always better at hiding. I searched every nook and cranny, every room, until I caught a glimpse of a shadow darting by.
Got you, Jack.
I mumbled and ran after him. But something was strange. The shadow seemed faster, slipping around corners as if leading me on. My excitement turned into doubt and fear. No matter how close I thought I was, the shadow always evaded me, disappearing just as I was about to catch up. Not long after, Jack finally came out of the master bedroom, scratching his head. He apologized, saying he had hidden in the closet and fallen asleep. But my heart skipped a beat. Who had I been chasing? I gasped and told Jack and the others what had happened. They laughed, teasing me for trying to scare them. Determined to prove it, I convinced them to play again. We played again. I resumed searching, but soon that uneasy feeling returned. The house was too quiet, too still. My friends were nowhere to be found, and the more I searched, the more convinced I became that something terrible had happened. Then I saw it again. A hand reached out from behind a wall, waving at me from a distance. Suddenly, I noticed a pair of shoes on the ground, just like Lexi's. I called out, but she didn't answer. The hand waved at me again from afar. I moved closer, but as I approached, the hand disappeared. I chased after it, only to find another arm waving from the top of the stairs. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't find anyone. Then I saw a face that looked like Rian's in the window. He stood still, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I knew something was wrong. I pressed my face against the window to get a closer look, and it was a child, about our age, but with a wrinkled, aged face, eerie and twisted. His clothes were stained with red patches, and I froze when I saw him holding something, a long, rusted, sharp metal rod. Before I could move, he spoke in a chilling voice.
"Oh, you found me.
Now it's my turn. He grinned widely, then began counting. 1, 2, 3. Panic surged through me. I didn't take the steps one by one. I bolted down the stairs as fast as I could. His laughter echoed behind me. I remembered the secret closet Jack had hidden in earlier. In desperation, I dove inside, pulling the door shut and holding my breath as I listened. I didn't dare make a sound. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying he would leave. I must have passed out from lack of oxygen. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. It turned out my parents and the police had been searching for us all night, and my friends had managed to escape to alert them. Later, we found out that he was the escaped mental patient the police had been searching for. Because he was as short as a child, he had crawled through the hole in the back wall and turned the abandoned house into his temporary hideout. His favorite thing to do was play hide and seek with children, and then harm them in various ways. The most terrifying part, the police still haven't caught him.
Horror story of school locker. Sure, here is the translation of your text into English. A few days ago, Anna attended a party. The police showed up, and everyone scattered. Anna took a shortcut, fell into the river, and has been missing since. When they found her, she was no longer alive. She had passed away. The principal asked Kat to clean out Anna's locker. It had been a week since the funeral, and ANA's mother still hadn't come to collect her belongings. Kat nodded, feeling both curious and fearful. Anna had been one of the popular girls, always surrounded by friends. The news of her sudden death had shocked everyone. She wasn't like that. I was quite shy and had almost no friends. She approached the locker, its dull gray door a stark contrast to the vibrant memories of its owner. She twisted the combination lock, and with a metallic click, it opened. Inside, the locker was neatly organized. It only took her a few minutes to scoop Anna's belongings into her backpack. There were just a few textbooks, a small makeup pouch, and a neatly folded scarf remaining. As she reached in to gather the items, a strange gust of wind brushed against the back of her neck, sending a shiver down her spine. She glanced around, but the hallway was empty. She picked up the scarf, its silk smooth and cool. She remembered that Anna always wore this scarf like a treasured possession. It seemed that she really loved it. Suddenly, a whisper echoed in the confined space, telling her that the scarf was beautiful and would suit her perfectly. Her heart pounded. Perhaps she had imagined it. She continued cleaning the locker, but the unease lingered. As she closed the door, the whisper came again, more insistent this time, telling her,
Wear it always, and everyone will admire you.
How could she refuse? Even as goosebumps rose on her skin, she nodded and tied the scarf around her neck. Although it was silk, it felt heavy, pressing down on her bones. Kat looked up at the mirror and almost screamed. She didn't just look like Anna in that moment. She was Anna. The scarf somehow warped her skin, transforming her face. She pulled with all her strength, but it wouldn't come off. Her elbow struck the mirror, causing it to bleed. Then a voice whispered,
It's okay.
and assured her that everyone would love her. She decided to take a chance and see if it was true. Days passed, and she began to notice changes. People who had never acknowledged her before started to smile and greet her. The popular crowd invited her to sit with them at lunch. Kat enjoyed the attention she was receiving. She attributed the change to her makeover and the confidence boost from wearing Anna's scarf, so she didn't believe it too much. But the whispers started again and wouldn't stop. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw Anna's reflection staring back at her, smiling that familiar, haunting smile. It was as if Anna was still there, watching, waiting. Day by day, the whispers grew into screams in her head. Panic set in. She stumbled, knocking over her bedside lamp. As she went to school, she always avoided that locker because she felt a dark presence looming around Anna's locker. Kat's breath caught in her throat as she tried to pull the scarf off, but it tightened, choking her. Then a voice echoed in her head, asking what she was doing. The next day, she decided to return the scarf to Anna's locker, hoping to break the curse. When she approached the locker, the hallway was eerily silent. She unlocked it and placed the scarf inside. Before she could close the door, the scarf flew up and wrapped around her neck again. She fell to the floor, the scarf tightening more and more. Her vision darkened, and the last thing she saw was her own reflection in the locker mirror, her face now twisted into a smile that wasn't hers. A few days later, students whispered about Kat's disappearance. Her locker remained shut, and the smell of decay began to permeate the hallway. The principal and the janitor tried to open it, but the new lock seemed fused shut. Only Kat had the combination. One evening, as the janitor was mopping the empty hallway, he heard a faint whisper.
Wear it, and everyone will admire you.
The janitor glanced around, but saw nothing. He shook his head, thinking it was his imagination. But as he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in a nearby window. He saw Kat's face staring back at him, a silk scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, smiling that haunting, familiar smile. The janitor gradually turned pale and was so frightened that his heart felt like it was going to jump out of his chest. He ran out of there as fast as he could and immediately went to the police station to report what he had just witnessed. At first, he thought it was just an illusion, but when he linked it with Anna's departure and Kat's disappearance, it was really a coincidence, as if there was some kind of curse. Sometime later, the police came and took the cabinet out of the school. The mystery of Kat's disappearance and the scarf remains a mystery that no one wants to talk about.
The murderer on Christmas night. Christmas is usually a time of peace and joy, but sometimes it's when the strangest and most terrifying things can happen. The story is about when I was a child. At that time, to be honest, Christmas wasn't my favorite holiday. Sure, the gifts, food, and Santa Claus were great, but somehow, all of that always felt empty to me. While everyone was gathered talking, I went to the dining room to play alone, and that's when everything started. At that time, I thought maybe I had watched too many horror movies, but I swear I saw someone through the window. A shadow passed by the window, just for a second. It was a person, but their face wasn't normal. The man wore a grotesque, demon-like mask. I froze in place. I moved closer to the window to see better, but there was nothing there. I thought maybe it was just my imagination. Then, suddenly, the man lunged forward with the mask, his mouth twisted into a wide, grotesque grin. He gently tapped on the window and pointed at the front door. After that, he moved away from the window and walked toward the front door. A few seconds later, someone began knocking on the door. I ran to warn my dad, but he brushed it off, thinking it was just Uncle Henry bringing in beer. He even joked that I was probably imagining everything because I was bored. My dad hesitated as he stepped toward the door, reluctantly opening it. It was Uncle Henry, which confused me even more. I didn't know what was going on. Despite Uncle Henry's comforting presence, the strange feeling I had didn't go away. I didn't know what to say anymore. I was scared, but my dad seemed to think it was just a prank. My body trembled as I went back upstairs, locked the door, and shoved a chair under the doorknob, trapping myself in my room, trying to escape the growing fear inside me. As night fell, and the family gathered outside to watch the fireworks, I stayed inside, staring out of my bedroom window at the bright lights. Suddenly, someone began knocking on my room door. I was about to open it when I realized something was wrong. I looked back out the window. My mom, dad, grandparents, and uncle were all downstairs. So, who was knocking on the door? I stepped toward the door, my hand trembling as I touched the doorknob. I paused for a second, then looked through the peephole. It wasn't my parents. It was him, the man wearing the demon mask. His voice was deep, but I could still hear it clearly. There was no mistaking it. He insisted that I let him in, promising me horrors if I refused. He even taunted me, threatening to kill me like he had with other children. Terrified, the first refused to open the door, only to hear the door starting to splinter as the masked man tried to break in. I screamed for help, but they outside didn't know the danger lurking inside. In a desperate attempt to cry for help, at the same time, my parents struggled to open the locked back door, which had been mysteriously sealed from the inside. They were panicked, unable to get into the house. As the masked man continued pounding on the door, I watched in horror as the wood began to crack. He was close to getting in, and I could feel my life slipping away. The door shattered, and the man, his face still hidden behind the grotesque demon mask, stepped into the room. He grabbed my neck with terrifying strength. My body writhed, trying to escape his grip. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought this was it. But then, a loud crash sounded from outside the window. He looked up for a moment, distracted. My dad realized the severity of the situation, climbed the ladder to the window, and threw a rock through it. The glass shattered. Without hesitation, my dad climbed through the broken window and rushed into the room just in time to pull him away. He didn't stop there, though. He took a knife and lunged toward my dad. My dad tried to dodge the strike, but the blade grazed his shoulder painfully. Still, he pushed forward. As my dad desperately fought to subdue him, I grabbed a metal lamp from the bedside table and struck him on the head. He staggered back, dazed. Outside, the sound of sirens could finally be heard. We were saved at last. When they caught the man, he referred to himself as the Grinch. They said he was responsible for many child disappearances around my age, and some bodies had been found and buried in his backyard. Since that day, many months later, I still see a therapist because of that man. Every time I sleep, I dream about what would have happened if I hadn't locked my door. I survived, yes, but the nightmares will never leave me. Secrets hidden in the basement. Leo, a college student desperate to find a job during his winter break, stumbled upon a strange ad on Craigslist. The ad lacked details, but the salary was too good to pass up for a simple housekeeping job at the home of an elderly woman named Mrs. Donovan. At the end of the ad, there was a phone number. An elderly woman answered the call and gave him an address to visit the next day. The next day, Leo arrived at Mrs. Donovan's house, a peculiar old wooden house surrounded by a vast garden of towering red roses. Their charcoal black stems stood out against the vibrant petals. Mrs. Donovan warmly welcomed him, an elderly woman with sharp gray eyes and an air of mystery. She gave him a tour of the large house, filled with books on botany and strange plants. Her library was vast, and there was something about those books that made him feel uneasy. Then she led Leo out to the garden, full of strange plants, especially the roses he had noticed earlier. She began praising the roses as the work of her life and gave him detailed instructions on how to care for the garden. Inside, she offered Leo a cup of coffee and instructed him on some tasks around the house while she was out. She said,
Everything must be cared for as it is when I leave. Just tend to the plants. One rule, don't go into the basement.
At first, Leo found her expression a bit odd, though nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Many people have restrictions on certain rooms in their homes. His curiosity was piqued, but soon set aside. After Mrs. Donovan left, he spent the next few hours tending to the plants, ensuring each was watered and cared for properly. Leo took a deep breath and noticed something odd. The scent of the flowers was overpowering, almost metallic. Moreover, the rose petals were much thicker than a typical rose. Just then, a bee buzzed past Leo's head, startling him as he grabbed a rose. The red petals crumbled in his hand, but something was strange. His hand felt slick and sticky. Leo opened his palm. A thick red liquid oozed from the broken petals, staining his hand. It was unlike any flower Leo had ever seen. It looked like blood. Shuddering, Leo rushed back inside to wash his hands. Suddenly, he heard an echoing noise from the basement. It grew louder, like a cry for help. Despite Mrs. Donovan's strict instructions, curiosity and concern drove Leo to the basement door. He descended the stairs, the faint light from his phone illuminating a metal door hidden at the end of the hallway. A faint whimper sent chills down his spine. Something was terribly wrong behind that door. With trembling hands, he pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit room. Iron cages lined the walls. From one of them, he heard a faint plea for help.
Help me.
Then he saw her, a young woman curled up in the corner of a cage, her pale face covered in scratches, her body showing signs of severe malnutrition. Leo was shocked and horrified. The woman explained that Mrs. Donovan had kept her imprisoned and fed her body to her monstrous plants. Just as he began planning her rescue, he heard the front door open. Mrs. Donovan had returned unexpectedly. As she entered, dragging a large suitcase behind her, Leo tried to remain calm, pretending everything was normal. She squinted, tilting her head as she studied him.
You look pale. Are you okay?
Mrs. Donovan's smile vanished. Her gaze shifted toward the basement door, then back to Leo.
You went somewhere you shouldn't have, didn't you?
Mrs. Donovan suddenly grabbed a pruning knife from her suitcase and slashed at Leo. He dodged, the blade striking wood and splintering it. Leo shoved a chair forward, knocking her off balance, then sprinted toward the basement, slamming the door behind him and locking it with a rusty latch. Leo reached for his phone but realized it was missing. Panic surged within him. Then he remembered the landline phone in the kitchen. He needed to get there without being caught by Mrs. Donovan. Leo spotted a broom and an old coat in the corner of the basement. Quickly, he propped the broom against the wall, draped the coat over it to mimic a human figure, then grabbed a pipe from the floor and hurled it against the wall to create a loud noise. The distraction worked. As she stormed through the door, it gave Leo just enough time to slip into the kitchen. He dashed to the phone, grabbed the landline, and dialed 911 with trembling hands. She realized and quickly returned. Leo grabbed a pan from the counter and struck her arm, causing the knife to drop to the floor.
Help! She's trying to kill me.
Leo screamed into the phone, his voice desperate. Leo dodged, grabbed a bottle of fertilizer from the counter, and hurled it into her face. The powder temporarily blinded her, giving Leo a chance to grab the knife and point it at her. Her wild grin sent shivers down his spine. The front door burst open, and police stormed in. Mrs. Donovan lunged desperately at Leo, but the officers tackled her to the ground and restrained her. Shortly after, her garden was destroyed and burned to ashes by authorities. They uncovered the horrifying truth about Mrs. Donovan's experiments with carnivorous plants that thrived on blood and human flesh. The truth about her dark experiments was revealed. She was sent to a mental institution where she would spend the rest of her life. This nightmare was something Leo would never forget. The deadly neighbor. My family and I moved into a house in the suburbs, and the neighbors seemed friendly until I met Mara. She happened to be the neighbor next door, and my mom quickly befriended her. At first, she seemed kind and friendly, often visiting my mom for coffee chats, but there was something unsettling about her. One afternoon, Mara visited us. She and my mom were chatting on the balcony, and I don't know why I was there. Probably out of boredom, but I sat with them. Before my mom stood up to get a cake she had just baked, I was still sitting at the table with Mara, and that's when my life might have changed forever. Mara was a ghostly-looking woman, thin with long black hair and unnaturally large yellow eyes. Her eyes were so unnatural that maintaining eye contact for more than 3 seconds felt impossible. We sat in silence until she suddenly turned toward me, a creepy smile spreading across her face. She began tilting her head slowly from side to side, almost like a puppet, and then said, "Are you ready to go now, little one?" I froze in place. Her voice had changed significantly. There was something darker about it. She began pulling out a black rose from her purse, an odd-looking flower, and held it out toward me. It was the first time I'd ever seen a black rose, and I started sweating from fear. Before I could react, my mom returned with the tray of cake, and Mara suddenly reverted to normal, as if someone flipped a switch. She quietly placed the black rose back into her purse, her face expressionless, and my mom didn't notice. I left the balcony, trying to dismiss the encounter, but something inside me knew that she was no ordinary neighbor. At night, my room was on the ground floor, and my window was high up. To be honest, I was never an easily frightened kid, but that night, I didn't know why, a strange feeling flooded my mind. I kept tossing and turning, nervously checking and peeking out the window every 5 minutes. Finally, as I began to drift off, I decided to look out the window one last time to ease my mind. But to my horror, Mara was standing at my window, the faint moonlight illuminating her smudged, grinning lips, just like the eerie smile I had seen on her face earlier that afternoon. I began walking toward the door with trembling legs, sweat pouring down like rain. As I kept moving, Mara's sinister yellow eyes followed me in slow, puppet-like motions. I reached for the doorknob, but then she raised the black rose again and muttered those eerie words. "I hope you're ready now." I screamed, "Please leave me alone." The moment I said that, her smile disappeared, replaced by an angry scowl as she shook her head side to side in disapproval. Then the worst happened. Mara was trying to get inside. She gripped the window frame and began slamming herself against it with both hands. Horrified, I watched as the window slid open, and she began pushing her head through the gap. Mara's body twisted unnaturally, like a puppet manipulated by invisible strings. Panicking, I grabbed the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. It was stuck. I couldn't open the door. She was almost inside. I heard her laughter, a sound that sent terror coursing through my veins. "You will come with me. You will be my last one." Suddenly, the door opened, and I bolted out of the room, screaming for my dad. He was a light sleeper, and when I burst into his room, he jumped out of bed in a panic. All I could say was, "Mara, the window." You know how people vanish when someone else comes? The same happened to me. I caught a glimpse of Mara leaving. I saw her in the distance, disappearing into the shadows beyond a house as the faint glow of lights passed over her. But my dad didn't see her. He checked the window, but Mara was gone. The next morning, I woke up to see police cars parked outside Mara's house. They were murmuring that the police had found something horrific inside her home. I was grateful to be alive. They had found innocent lives, 4 children's bodies buried in her backyard. With each body, she had buried a black rose, as if part of some dark ritual. And I might have been the last one. To this day, I wake up at night drenched in sweat, terrified that Mara is standing near my bed, tilting her head to the left with that same malicious smile, whispering, "You will come with me." The ride on the strange road. I live a straightforward life, and I'm certain that what I saw and heard on New Year's Eve last year wasn't a hallucination or anything like that. It was 100% real. A friend of mine, Darren, had his family host a New Year's Eve party at their house, where all the family's friends were invited. It was in one of those affluent neighborhoods and could only be accessed via rural roads. There were no other houses along the turn, except for a hastily built, solitary house that seemed abandoned for years, occasionally with flickering lights visible. After a few minutes of driving, I saw something ahead among the trees. As I got closer, I could see it was the figure of a person standing alone by the roadside. A woman, clearly dressed in a white dress, was standing completely still, looking out of place in the cold winter weather. Although I briefly considered stopping to help, when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw her slowly turn around, seemingly following me with a cold, eerie gaze. When I arrived at Darren's house, I pushed the unsettling experience out of my mind and enjoyed the party. After ringing in the new year, I stayed a bit longer to help clean up, as I was one of Darren's close family friends. As I left and started my car, I noticed the low tire pressure light was on. My car was an older model, so it didn't specify which tire. I remembered this often happened when the weather turned cold, so I didn't think much of it. I could take an alternate route home to avoid the road where I saw the woman, but it would add about 20 minutes. I decided to tough it out and take the old route. I truly wish I hadn't, even for just a few seconds. Something was off with the tires. I could hear it too, a sound like metal scraping against the road. Foolishly, I got out of the car. The headlights automatically turned off, plunging me into the deep darkness of the surrounding forest. Using my phone flashlight, I inspected each tire and found one mysteriously torn to shreds. Stranded in an area with no cell signal, everything grew eerily silent. Suddenly, I heard the chilling voice of a woman saying,
I see you.
Then I aimed my flashlight straight ahead again. Standing at the edge of the trees was the woman in the white dress. This time, her features were clear. Her dress was stained with mud, her frame was gaunt and pale, and her tangled hair hung down to her elbows. I sprinted toward Darren's house, hearing the sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves behind me. She was chasing me, but I managed to lose her quickly. I finally made it to Darren's house. I banged on the door, pleading for them to open it. I explained what had happened. They offered to let me stay overnight while they called the police and arranged for a tow truck. But I soon realized it wasn't over. I woke up to the sound of knocking at 3 a.m. Of course, none of the windows in the room had curtains. I didn't dare look outside until I heard a deep, raspy voice. I sat frozen on the bed, listening to the sound of stones hitting the window. The voice of that woman echoed from the darkness.
I see you.
Admittedly, I might be a coward, but at that moment, all I could do was hide under the blanket and avoid looking outside. I stayed silent until morning. The next morning, Darren's father found a large, rusty knife that didn't belong to the family, likely the one the woman had used to slash my tires. But this also meant she had followed my car to the party. After they called the police, I gave my statement. I suggested they check the cabin along the road because I had a feeling that the woman was connected to it. Eventually, they investigated and updated me, saying they didn't find anyone living there, but there were many dried animal carcasses scattered throughout the surrounding forest. The woman I saw was never found, which of course raises many questions. But the most terrifying thing to me is how she was able to track me so quickly. I started this year's journey determined not to let fear dictate my actions. The events of last New Year's Eve haunted me every day, but I was tired of running from the darkness. I convinced myself that she was merely a ghost, and the other events were just eerily perfect coincidences. But this time, I decided to take a detour, a different route to Darren's party, and it was much farther than the one I had taken before. Something felt off. The GPS signal cut out midway, and the road I was on seemed unfamiliar. I wasn't too familiar with the area, so I followed the path I remembered most vividly. And then, as if by fate, the winding road curved, and I found myself facing it. That house by the roadside, it still bore the taped-off markings from when the police had been there. I parked the car, engine still running, and sat for a moment, staring at it. A chill ran down my spine, but I slowly stepped out of the car. Gathering all my courage, I stepped onto the porch. The wooden steps creaked under my weight. I knocked once. Nothing. Then I slowly pushed the door open. The wooden house looked even more dilapidated, with parts of the roof sagging, rotting beams, rickety furniture, a few broken chairs, and a fireplace stuffed with what looked like bones. I stepped closer, and that's when I heard it, almost like a whisper, unmistakable.
Come closer.
It sent shivers down my spine. Then, I turned on my phone's flashlight. Another horrifying sight revealed itself before me. I saw the walls. They were covered in crude drawings, scratched into the surface, as if by something sharp, along with claw marks that looked agonizing. Names were scrawled beneath each face. The horrifying part was seeing one that matched my own. When the light stopped at a wooden table in the middle of the room, I saw a sharp knife, a few jars filled with dark red liquid, and even animal teeth. I started to wonder, could someone have moved in here? Could it belong to a hunter? I didn't think these things had been here for long, as the police had said the house was completely empty when they searched it.
You're braver than I thought.
A voice emerged from the darkness. I spun around. She stood at the far end of the room, tall, pale, and gaunt. Her white dress was smeared with mud and streaks of red, her deranged eyes staring right at me. She lunged at me with terrifying speed. In her hand, she held a knife, and it was aimed straight at me. I instinctively grabbed the knife on the table nearby to defend myself. I swung it, but she dodged and shoved me to the ground. We struggled, our heavy breaths and screams echoing in the cramped space. She laughed maniacally, her nails clawing into my skin. Everything happened so fast, filled with panic. I fought back, using all my strength to shove her off. I reached for the knife that had fallen to the ground, grabbed it, and stabbed her in the shoulder. Her scream pierced the air. She screamed, but didn't stop. Her eyes burned with madness.
You won't escape, Drake.
Charging at me again, I grabbed a jar from the same table and smashed it over her head. This time, she staggered, visibly dazed, and slowly collapsed. Without hesitation, I ran out of there and barricaded the door with a wooden plank nearby, hoping it would hold her off for a while. I got into my car and immediately called the police. I didn't stop until I reached Darren's house, trembling and covered in blood. The police arrived shortly after my call. They didn't find her in the house, but this time she couldn't escape. The trail of blood from her wounds led into the forest. In their report, they said she was a deranged individual who had been stalking people traveling this deserted route, including me. She had set up horrifying traps to play with me. It turned out that all along, I had mistaken her for a ghost conjured by my paranoia or something far more sinister that I couldn't comprehend. Seeking the truth. The city never sleeps, and Kevin does his best to make a living as a night shift taxi driver. He is a hard-working and kind man. One foggy night, as Kevin followed his usual route, he turned a corner onto a quiet, nearly deserted street and saw her. A woman stood alone under the flickering glow of a street lamp. She was dressed in black, her long hair hanging loose, and her pale hand raised to hail his taxi. Something about her seemed off, but Kevin's job wasn't to ask questions, it was to drive. The woman climbed into the back seat without a word, handing him a piece of paper with a hastily scrawled address. The address was unfamiliar to him and seemed unsettling. As they drove through increasingly deserted streets, Kevin tried to make conversation, but she remained coldly silent. When they finally arrived, a decaying, abandoned house on the edge of a forest loomed in the darkness. Kevin stopped the car, unease building as he turned to tell her they had arrived and mentioned the fare. Then Kevin turned around to find the back seat empty. The door was shut, and the woman was gone, as though she had never been there. No money, no sound, no trace. Confusion mixed with a hint of anger as he stared into the darkness. He chalked it up to a strange, unlucky night and drove away, determined to forget it. A few days later, Kevin was driving through the city again. Once more, he saw a woman standing by the roadside. She looked eerily familiar. The dress, the posture, the loose hair. Was it the same woman? Kevin wasn't sure. He hadn't paid close attention to her face last time. But this time, she seemed different. She was clutching her stomach as if injured or ill. Her face was pale and strained, as though in great pain. She looked like she was struggling to stay upright. Kevin hesitated, memories of the previous encounter surfacing, but he couldn't ignore her distress and slowly pulled over. He parked by the curb and rolled down the window.
Are you okay?
She didn't answer, her lips trembling, but after a moment, she slowly looked up. The woman's gaze met his briefly, her wide, haunting eyes struggling to utter a single whispered word.
Help!
Kevin wasn't the type to ignore someone in need. He told her to get in and said he would take her where she needed to go. She quietly got into the car, her breathing shallow and labored, but she said nothing more. Her presence was icy. She handed him a piece of paper. It was an address near the edge of the forest, close to the previous location. An eerie coincidence. This time, the destination was a hospital instead of an old house. The ride was bizarre. Occasionally, he glanced at her, her hand pressed tightly against her stomach, but she remained utterly still. Her breathing was nearly inaudible, like the distant whisper of the wind, hollow and empty. After what felt like an eternity, Kevin stopped the car, but a cold breeze brushed his ear, sending chills down his spine.
Help me!
A cold draft swept into the car, making him shiver. When Kevin turned around, the woman was gone. The rear door was wide open, and the seat she had occupied was empty.
What the hell is happening?
The woman's sudden disappearance left him frozen in place, unsure of what to do. His hands trembled as he locked the doors, quickly started the engine, and drove away as fast as he could. Back at home, Kevin couldn't shake the encounter. Questions gnawed at him. Who was that woman? How did she disappear? And why did she lead him there? Something strange was going on. After days of pondering, Kevin couldn't shake the fear tormenting him. He returned to the hospital, hoping to find answers. He asked the staff about the woman he had seen, but no one seemed to know anything about her. But after all that, he found no leads. In his moment of despair, he suddenly saw the shadow of the woman he had seen before. She was standing at the end of the hospital corridor, and the place felt eerily empty, save for the two of them. Unable to explain why, he followed her to a locker belonging to a man. The name on the locker read Dr. Don. He had no idea what this meant. Was there a connection between her and this man? Moments later, Kevin was still standing in the hallway, but she was gone. Instead, the usual sounds of hospital staff working, patients moving, and the general hum of life returned. Everything seemed normal again. As Kevin contemplated leaving, unsure of who this Dr. Don was, a nurse's voice called out from behind him, "Dr. Don." He froze and turned to see a tall, slender doctor with a beard and glasses that gave him an air of intellect. Kevin noticed that the people around seemed to hold him in high regard. Kevin questioned himself. Was there anything suspicious about a man like that? He certainly didn't seem the type. Still, Kevin decided to sit and observe. Dr. Don stepped out of his office and headed toward the exit. Kevin quietly followed until the doctor turned around to look at him. The doctor didn't appear worried at all and spoke in a calm, composed voice.
Hello, can I help you with something?
Kevin, feeling flustered, lied and said he was visiting his girlfriend here. Kevin deflected by glancing at his name tag.
Dr. Don, this is my first time seeing you. You seem well liked.
The doctor smiled politely and excused himself, but Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Kevin returned to the corridor, beginning to feel ridiculous and questioning if he was taking things too far. Then, the woman appeared again at the end of the hallway. A whisper close to his ear said,
Help me, please.
Kevin froze, but the encounter reinforced his resolve. Maybe it was time to follow his instincts. Dr. Don's silhouette was retreating. Kevin decided to follow him cautiously, and, strangely, Dr. Don was heading toward the very house the woman had led him to before. The old, decaying, and completely isolated house. The windows of the house were nearly boarded up. After a while, Dr. Don left the house through the front door, locking it behind him. Kevin pressed himself against a pile of wood nearby to avoid being seen. Once Dr. Don was out of sight, Kevin crept to the back of the house and, to his surprise, found the door unlocked. Opening it cautiously, Kevin stepped inside. Inside was a mess of decay and foul odors. Rubber gloves, small glass jars, and scraps of fabric were scattered across the floor, along with dark, dried stains. Kevin felt a chill run down his spine as he heard sounds coming from a room not far away. The door was shut tight and locked. Breaking it open would cause a loud noise and be extremely risky. Suddenly, she appeared again, standing next to a cabinet. Her eyes locked onto Kevin before shifting toward the cabinet. It revealed a key hidden behind the shelf. In an instant, she vanished once more, perhaps guiding Kevin. Just as Kevin reached for the key, he heard footsteps approaching. Panicked, he hid in a small cabinet, barely fitting inside before Dr. Don returned. Through the crack of the cabinet door, Kevin saw him open the room and drag out a heavy bag. The doctor retrieved a syringe and a small glass vial, proceeding to do something suspicious. A creak inadvertently escaped from the cabinet where Kevin was hiding. Dr. Don put his tools down and approached the cabinet. Kevin held his breath, preparing for the worst. As Dr. Don got closer, Kevin realized he had no escape. Seizing the moment, he burst out, pushing the doctor to the ground before dashing into the forest behind the house. Dr. Don chased after Kevin, At the edge of the forest, Kevin managed to call the police. As they ran deeper into the woods, Kevin's years of experience in the wilderness began to pay off. His eyes caught a marked tree stump. He remembered traps he had learned about as a child, the kind hunters used for animals. It was a net trap leading to a concealed pit. Kevin stopped, carefully observing and calculating. Dr. Don approached with a scalpel in hand.
You know too much. This will be quick, he sneered.
As he neared the trap, Kevin deliberately moved slowly, calmly observing. Suddenly, Kevin jumped aside. Doctor. Don lunged forward, oblivious to the trap. Bam! A loud snap echoed as he fell into the concealed pit, screaming in pain. Shortly after, the police arrived and uncovered the horrifying events that had taken place in the house. Doctor. Don's past was plagued by an abusive father. He had built a facade of respectability, but was, in reality, a monster. He would overdose his patients with drugs and record their suffering while laughing maniacally. Many had met unjust ends at the hands of this madman. The woman Kevin had seen was found deceased at the scene. She had sought help, likely for her sister, who had also been held captive in the same house. They had both uncovered Dr. Don's depravity. Kevin was haunted by everything he had experienced. He wondered how many others like her had wandered into the dark corners of the world, waiting for someone to help before it was too late. In the end, though, Dr. Don finally faced justice. The mysterious harmony from the ancient piano. Nee, a young woman in her early 20s, stepped into a small, dimly lit antique shop in a quiet neighborhood. The shop was cluttered with antiques, old books, worn furniture, dusty frames, and a few musical instruments scattered around. The air reeked of aged wood and forgotten memories. Nee walked past the counter where the shopkeeper stood. He stared at her with wide, unblinking eyes, as if he had been waiting. His face was gaunt, his skin pale. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was strange.
You found the piano. It's calling you. It will begin soon.
The word sent a chill down her spine, since she hadn't mentioned the piano. The atmosphere grew odd. She decided to look around briefly and leave quickly. Then, Nee's gaze landed on a piano, old and tucked away in the corner of the shop. Despite its age, its darkened wood seemed to exude a mysterious allure. She brushed her fingers lightly over the keys. The instrument's delicate beauty starkly contrasted its eerie presence, making it irresistible. She approached the counter to face the man again. This time, she noticed his hands were marked with faint, dark scars, as if burned or clawed repeatedly, the lines deep and jagged. She decided to take the piano and leave. The door chimed behind her, and she turned to see the shopkeeper standing at the window, staring at her unblinkingly as she walked away. From the moment she placed it in her room, strange things began to happen. Nee began to play the piano softly, trying to familiarize herself with its peculiar presence. The keys, though old, worked, but felt strange beneath her fingers. Suddenly, Nee stopped playing. The music lingered in the air for a moment before dissolving into faint whispers. She stood, heart racing, unsure of what had just happened. One night, after a restless sleep, she returned to the piano. Nee found a yellowed sheet of music tucked among the piano strings. Curious yet uneasy, she played it, only to discover the notes resonated in an inexplicable way. It felt as though the notes were alive, playing themselves before her fingers touched the keys. Unintentionally, Nee had begun to unlock the tragic history of the piano's previous owner. She continued to play, unable to understand why she couldn't stop. She heard a faint voice whispering in her ear, speaking an ancient language. The words seemed to echo in her mind, filling her thoughts. She stood up abruptly, thinking she was probably too tired, and decided to head to her room and sleep. Nee drifted into slumber after a tense day. She was no longer in her room, but found herself in a grand concert hall. The room was empty, except for a grand piano at its center, and dim light from antique chandeliers that looked decades old. As Nee approached the piano, she saw a tall, gaunt man seated at the keys. He wore an old black suit, but his sunken eyes and pale skin made him look like a wax statue. Nee called out,
Who's there?
The man slowly turned around. His gaze pierced through Nee, and his voice echoed like a distant whisper.
I've waited a long time.
Nee tried to step back, but it felt like her feet were pinned to the floor. The man glided closer, not moving his legs, as if floating on air. Then the man pointed toward an old table nearby. On it lay a dusty sheet of music titled Sonata of Eternity.
There's not much time left. Only this melody can save us, or drown us both.
Before Nee could respond, the space around her twisted into a black vortex, engulfing her. She woke up with a start, drenched in sweat, clutching a corner of her blanket. Everything around her was silent. The dream not only left a haunting impression, but also led Nee to crucial details in reality. Perhaps she had unwittingly opened a door, allowing the spirits and tragic memories of the composer to resurface. She could still recall the image of the man struggling amidst the shadows, his eyes filled with despair, as if begging her to uncover the truth. She stopped playing the piano. For days, she couldn't bring herself to touch the instrument. Night after night, Nee heard whispers growing louder and more persistent, making everything feel increasingly unbearable.
Help me. Free me from the curse.
These words seemed to come from the trapped soul of the composer, still bound to the piano through his music. Waking in despair, Nee approached the piano, slowly sitting down. She noticed a small, faint mirror appearing behind the instrument. Nee cautiously wiped the dust from the mirror. Beneath the grime, the figure of a man slowly emerged. The gaunt man, his deep, dark eyes locked onto hers. He said nothing, but his gaze was intense, almost pleading, as if trying to convey something. After staring into the mirror, Nee saw words gradually appear on the glass. The crooked writing seemed as though someone was etching it from the other side. You have only one chance. Then his bony, emaciated hand reached out from the mirror, grasping toward her, begging for salvation. Understand the final rhythm before you play.
Please, help me. Save me.
A weight pressed against her chest before everything returned to normal. Nee realized she had to complete the sonata. The only way to break the curse was to finish the music she had started. She was plunged into despair and fear as she realized the price of freeing him. If she didn't play the final sonata, the curse would claim her as well. As Nee studied the sheet music, every note seemed distorted, warning her. It revealed the words, When the piano begins to play, you must finish the music before the light in the mirror fades. If not, the door will close forever. Nee swallowed hard, feeling the weight pressing down on her shoulders. Time was running out. It could happen at any moment. In her darkest hour, Nee sat before the piano, determined to break the curse. The clock struck midnight. The room was ice cold, and the music filled the air like an oppressive weight. Nee's fingers trembled as she began to play the sonata, the final piece in the composer's symphony of sorrow. But as she neared the final notes, Nee realized the sheet music was incomplete. A note had been erased, forcing her to rely on her intuition to finish the piece. She couldn't stop now. Then the mirror behind the piano shattered. Startled, she paused for half a second but couldn't stop. The gaunt figure of the man seemed to crack with the mirror, his eyes filled with despair.
Save me. Be careful. If you fail, you will take my place.
He cried out, his voice laced with agony. Nee played the final note, placing all her faith in her intuition. In the last moment of the sonata, the piano emitted a piercing sound. A brilliant light burst from the mirror, and she felt the entire room being drawn into the vortex. The man's figure vanished, and the room suddenly fell silent. In the ensuing silence, the figure in the mirror was gone, leaving behind a whispered,
"Thank you."
The room felt lighter, as if both their burdens had been lifted. When the light faded, Nee found herself sitting in her quiet room, all the strings of her instrument broken, and the mirror shattered. Exhausted, Nee collapsed on the piano. Perhaps everything was truly over, and fortunately, she had completed it. But deep down, Nee didn't know if she would ever truly escape the haunting melodies that had once drowned her. The haunting of invisible ghosts. His name was Henry, and he always enjoyed taking late-night walks. There was something about the stillness that made everything feel simpler. It had been this way for years, a nightly routine for him and his dog, Boss. Henry had been a welder for over 40 years. Now, he was living alone on this large farm. The house, too big for just one person, had felt empty ever since Maria, his wife, passed away. Henry's children had moved out long ago, and after cancer took his wife's life, it was just Henry, left alone with the memories. Tonight, after a long day, Henry decided to take a walk. The cool night air was refreshing, and his dog Boss trotted beside him, his nose sniffing the ground as if searching for something. As Henry made the loop around the house, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement in the second-story window. The bedroom window, the one that belonged to Maria. Henry stopped. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow, something or someone moving inside. Henry's heart raced, not believing his eyes. He hadn't set foot in that room for years, let alone let anyone else in. Henry stared up at the window, unsure if his mind was playing tricks on him. But something wasn't right. Without hesitation, he rushed inside, Boss close behind, and stormed up the stairs 2 at a time. When Henry reached the bedroom, the door creaked open slowly. The room was empty, exactly as he had left it. Henry's eyes scanned the space, nothing out of place, no signs of anyone being there. Henry felt foolish for overreacting, but that unease, that creeping sensation, stayed with him. Something had been there, Henry was sure of it. The next night, Boss's low growl woke Henry from a deep sleep. He sat up, listening, straining to hear over the pounding in his ears. That's when he heard the creaking of floorboards. Henry's first instinct was to grab his rifle, and he moved into the hallway, raising the gun. A dark figure stood at the end of the hall. A woman, her face obscured by shadows, her hand stretched toward him, fingers unnaturally long. Another night passed. Henry came downstairs early in the morning, only to find the kitchen lights on. He remembered turning them off. Henry grew tense and started calling the police. They searched the entire house, even bringing in the K-9 unit, but nothing turned up. Henry could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe him, but he knew something was wrong. That was the last straw. The next night, Henry went back upstairs. He didn't know what compelled him to return, but when he opened the door, the sight nearly stopped his heart. Maria's clothes, which Henry had packed away after she died, were scattered across the floor. It was as if someone had pulled them out. Panic rose in his throat. Henry staggered back, and that's when he saw her. A figure stood in the doorway. A woman, but it wasn't Maria. Henry couldn't make out her face, but she was shorter, thinner, someone he didn't recognize, and her presence filled him with dread. Before he could react, she ran, disappearing down the stairs and into the night. Henry chased her to the front yard, but she was gone by the time he made it outside. Bosley and Henry searched the property, but there was no trace of her. Henry didn't sleep that night. In fact, he hadn't slept in days. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside it all felt like her, lurking, waiting to return. Henry kept his rifle close, afraid he might actually have to use it. A few weeks later, it happened again. Henry was sitting in the living room, trying to distract himself with the television when he saw her. She was standing in the yard, staring at Henry through the window, just a shadow, silhouetted by the moonlight. Henry grabbed his rifle, his hands trembling, and ran outside, firing warning shots into the air. She turned and ran into the darkness, disappearing once again. The shots had probably scared her off for now, but deep down, he knew this wasn't over. The next day, after Henry had been out for errands and returned home late, he didn't see Boss greet him. He searched every corner of the house, but everything felt empty. But Henry still had one last room to check, Maria's room. He stumbled into the bedroom, the door creaking open. Maria's clothes were no longer scattered across the floor. They were neatly hung. But what Henry dreaded had come to pass. The woman was still there, sitting on the bed, staring at him. Her eyes gleamed, and she smiled a cold, twisted smile. She whispered that she had been waiting for him. Henry froze, shocked. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. That voice, it was Maria's. But something was wrong. It was cold, hollow. Before Henry could react, her face shifted from an indistinct blur to something grotesque, her skin melting into a monstrous form. The skin peeled away, revealing rotting flesh underneath. Her eyes sank into her skull, her mouth gaping in a horrifying grimace. Henry screamed and raised his rifle, but it was too late. She lunged at him, and as darkness engulfed him, her fingers seemed to scratch and penetrate his chest. The haunting of invisible ghosts. Henry slowly woke up with a strange feeling, something rough rubbing against his face. It took a moment for Henry to open his eyes and realize it was Boss licking his face. Henry remembered the last time he couldn't find his dog, but after everything that happened, seeing Boss made him feel more at ease. Henry groaned, his whole body aching as he struggled to sit up. Everything felt too stiff, the joints rigid, and the muscles dull with pain, as if she had actually lunged at him, clawing and piercing into his flesh. Boss whimpered softly, his gaze fixed on the bedroom door. Henry glanced over and saw nothing unusual, but he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something strange was inside his own home. Days passed in a vague exhaustion. Every night, it was the same. Boss sat in front of the bedroom door, staring, ears pricked up as if waiting for something. Then, like clockwork, at that exact hour, he would start barking, the sound echoing throughout the house, jolting Henry from his restless sleep. He would get up, gun in hand, and search the house, but he never found anything. The house remained silent, the darkness unchanged. He tried to convince himself that it was just Boss being protective, or perhaps reacting to something normal outside. One night, the barking started again, more intense than ever. He jumped up, hurried down the stairs, gun at the ready, and froze at the sight before him. There, near the living room window, Mari was standing. Her face was gentle, hair flowing in the wind. Henry was paralyzed, an uncontrollable feeling swelling within him. Henry hadn't seen her in years. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of comfort. Boss fell silent, his barking turning into a faint whimper, as if something wasn't quite right ahead. He slowly approached the window, but then something changed. Henry stepped back as Mari's gentle form began to fade, her features distorting, as if cracking horribly, her joints twisting grotesquely, unnaturally. Her eyes seemed to darken, sinking into her face. Her mouth stretched into a wide grin, revealing sharp teeth, with black slime oozing through the cracks in her face. He suddenly realized she had come, perhaps deceiving him and appearing in the form of Mari's spirit. He knew that couldn't be his wife. The figure by the window vanished, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. Henry rushed outside, desperately searching for her, or it, whatever he had just seen. He circled the house, calling for Mari, as if somehow she might still be there, but there was no one. As Henry turned the corner of the barn, he suddenly felt an icy chill. The world around him seemed to shift. The night grew unnaturally dark. It felt like the darkness was swallowing the farm. He heard a whisper, soft and mocking.
Henry.
It was her voice, but distorted and broken, drawing him toward the barn. Henry pushed open the barn door, and there she was again, Mari standing motionless. The whispers grew louder around him.
Come home, Henry. It's time.
The voice echoed from every direction. The darkness closed in, pulling him to his knees as if hypnotized to obey. Her form began to twist again, skin peeling away, revealing a skeletal grin beneath. The barn door slammed shut behind Henry with a piercing noise, swallowing the faint light of the moon. The air filled with voices chanting Henry's name, full of malice. He stumbled back, desperate to escape, but the ground beneath him gave way, sending him plunging into a deep, cold pit. He landed hard on a damp surface. Henry reeled from the overwhelming stench of decay, and as he looked around, rotting corpses with sunken eyes stared back at him. He tried to climb out, but the walls of the pit were slick. The bodies began to move, their skeletal hands reaching out, grabbing Henry's legs, pulling him down. A grotesque figure emerged from the darkness above. It was her again, a monstrous version of Mari. Limbs elongated, her smile impossibly wide, filled with jagged, blackened teeth.
Henry, it's time to join us,
she said. Then suddenly, Henry found himself in Mari's old room. The figure leaned closer, its icy breath brushing against his skin.
You can't escape, Henry.
He felt an unnatural pressure tightening around his neck, and he couldn't move. As his vision darkened, it was slowly taking control of him. The first light of dawn crept over the farm. The house lay still and cold, its windows dark and empty. Boss lingered on the porch, his mournful howl echoing across the silent fields. No one knew what really happened. Henry was gone, or perhaps he was still there, but no longer himself. Highway Trapmaker. It had been a long day of driving for me. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It was nearly 9 p.m. I stopped at a small gas station, dimly lit, filled up the tank, and bought an energy drink from the store. The cool night air brushed against my face as I stretched before climbing back into the truck. With a 3-hour drive ahead, I settled into the seat, ready for the journey. The open road stretched out before me, desolate, bathed in the soft glow of the headlights. My only companion was the music playing through the cabin. I drifted a bit, feeling slightly drowsy, and quickly focused back on the road, allowing my mind to wander as I sipped my drink, hoping it would help keep me awake. Around 11 p.m., a sudden crackle pulled me from my drowsiness. The sound came from the radio I had on the trucker channel. With everything so quiet, the noise startled me. Through the static, I thought I heard a voice, faint and unclear. The words were difficult to make out, but it sounded like hello or help. My heart raced a little faster as I glanced around, looking into the darkness behind the headlights, but there were no other vehicles in sight. I grabbed the radio and pressed the button, my voice trembling as I asked, "Is anyone out there? Do you need help?" I waited, listening to the static fill the silence, but there was no response. Just as I was about to release the button, my headlights caught something ahead on the road. I slowed the truck down, coming to a stop as I saw a large rig parked in the middle of the road. motionless. It was strange. There were no signs of anyone around, no lights, nothing at all. I pulled over to the side and climbed out, the chill of the night air making me shiver. As I approached the rig, I called out, my voice breaking the strange silence. Hello? Is anyone there? But my voice was swallowed by the emptiness around me. I climbed into the open door of the truck and looked inside. My heart sank as I realized it was empty. There was no one inside. The driver's seat vacant, but a jacket hung over the passenger seat, a half-finished cup of coffee in the holder. The radio was silent now, but a faint static still lingered in the air. It was as if the driver had simply vanished. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no clues as to where they had gone. A shiver ran down my spine, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave this place, a growing sense of unease gnawing at me. I stepped away from the rig, scanning my surroundings, my eyes sweeping over the dark fields on either side of the road. The tall grass swayed, casting eerie shadows that shifted under the moonlight. Then something peculiar caught my eye, a faded photo pinned to the dashboard. I squinted in the dim light, leaning in for a closer look. It was a family photo, the kind you might get at a cheap roadside stand. A man stood with his wife and daughter, smiling, carefree. I didn't recognize the man, but there was something in his expression that filled me with a sense of sadness. I stepped back, my gaze lingering on the photo as a chill ran down my spine. That's when I realized this truck wasn't just abandoned. Perhaps it was a trap, deliberately left here to lure someone, anyone, into this desolate stretch of road. A twig snapped behind me, the sudden noise cutting through the night like a knife. My instincts kicked in, and I whipped around just in time to see a figure emerging from the darkness, their face obscured. My heart raced as I took a step back, my mind scrambling for a plan. I was alone, isolated, surrounded only by trees and an empty highway. I couldn't run. He would catch me in seconds. Thinking quickly, I scrambled back into the empty truck, my hands shaking as I rummaged through the cabin. I found a wrench on the floor and gripped it tightly, crouching down inside the truck, preparing myself as I listened for approaching footsteps. The figure approached the open door, his face finally illuminated by the moonlight. He was grinning widely, a cold, threatening smile that made me shudder, and I realized with horrifying clarity that he had done this before. He stepped closer, moving slowly and deliberately, savoring the fear in my eyes. But I wouldn't go down without a fight. I charged at him, swinging the wrench with all my might, catching him off guard. We stumbled out of the truck, struggling on the ground. The night came alive with the sounds of our scuffle, grunts and the scrape of shoes on gravel. He was stronger than I was, but desperation fueled me, making me fight harder, faster. I tried to break free, staggering to my feet as he pulled back, clutching his shoulder. For a moment, we just stared at each other, both of us breathing heavily, the tension thick and suffocating. I gripped the wrench tightly, ready, but he hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty passing over his face. I seized on his hesitation, advancing with the wrench raised. He stepped back, the threat in his eyes replaced with something else, perhaps fear. He turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness, the sound of his footsteps fading until there was nothing but silence. I climbed back into my truck, locking the doors as I settled into the seat, my hands still trembling from what had just happened. I reached for the radio, my voice barely above a whisper as I called for help, my words spilling out in a rush. I told them everything. The abandoned truck, the photo, the man who attacked me. They assured me that help was on the way, that the police would be there soon. The flashing lights of the police car cut through the night, a relief after feeling like the darkness stretched on forever. I watched as the officers investigated the scene, their flashlights casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. One of the officers approached me, his expression grim as he recounted what they had found. The truck belonged to a man reported missing weeks ago. A man with a family, a wife and young daughter. They suspected foul play, but there was currently no sign of him. The man, they found footprints leading into the woods, but they ended abruptly, as if he had vanished into thin air. It was as if the darkness itself had swallowed him, leaving nothing but an unsettling silence. The sun began to rise as I sat in the truck. The police had temporarily concluded their investigation, saying they would keep me updated, that they would do everything they could to find the missing man and bring the attacker to justice. I took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I didn't know what awaited me ahead, but I knew one thing: I had survived that night and escaped the trap he had set. A few days later, I was called to the police station to discuss the investigation. A policeman sat across from me, his eyes serious as he flipped through a thick stack of papers. He explains that they have identified both the attacker and the missing man, piecing together the details of a dark plot. The attacker, a vagrant with a violent history, was responsible for a series of disappearances along this stretch of highway. He preyed on both truckers and tourists, luring them in with abandoned cars, like the one I found, using them as bait to satisfy his twisted sense of control. The man in the photo is one of his victims, but this time, the attacker did not escape. After he ran away from me that night, he made a mistake, leaving behind clues that led the police to him. They find him hiding in an old, dilapidated farmhouse on the outskirts of town, the walls covered with memorabilia stolen from his victims. The officer who showed me the photo from the abandoned truck, now sealed in a plastic evidence bag, told me they would notify the victim's family. I stared at the photo, feeling a mixture of relief and bitterness, knowing that this monster would no longer haunt the highway, no longer tear apart the lives of innocent people. The Blonde Girl. This is a story that happened a long time ago when I visited my local library. I have always been drawn to the lonely silence of old libraries. The air inside was heavy with the smell of old paper and dust, and the walls were lined with towering bookshelves that. I remember that I went there to borrow a few educational books. The internet existed at that time, but you couldn't just Google anything you wanted to know. The more conventional method for me was to go to the library and check out books on the subjects I was interested in. Anyway, I drove to the library, which was only about a 5-minute drive from my house. I walked in just as the library was about to close. I thought I was the only one in the library. As I walked through the aisles, my footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floor. The daylight outside was fading, casting long, strange shadows through the narrow windows. The library was quite large, and I headed to the section of books I was looking for. I felt immersed there. The silence was pleasant, only occasionally broken by the rustle of turning pages. I started looking for the best books to borrow. I spent a few minutes browsing and comparing the books. As evening approached, I decided to look at a particularly intriguing book I had found on spirituality, the supernatural, and horror. It was the only one on the shelf, and I picked it up. Some passages of the book talked about a blonde girl who had been brutally murdered, horrifically, by ancient cursed legends. She was like a sacrificial offering. Just as I was about to leave, a chill ran down my spine. I glanced over my shoulder and saw her, a blonde girl standing in the far corner of the library. She was partially obscured by the shadows, the light fading dimly. There was something unsettling about her presence, an eerie silence that seemed to absorb all sound around her. She seemed almost out of place. This woman appeared quite young, with blonde hair, wearing a polka dot headband as if from many decades ago. My heart began to race. The girl didn't move, her gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I hesitated, unsure whether to call out to her or quietly leave. As I watched, the girl took a few small, slow steps forward, revealing a pale, emotionless face. Her eyes were dark voids, empty and soulless. I felt a wave of terror wash over me, paralyzing me with fear. The girl took one step closer, then another, moving silently across the floor. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. She moved closer, her movements deliberate and haunting. When she was just a few meters away, she stopped and tilted her head to one side, as if studying me. Finally, I found the strength to move. I slowly backed away, my eyes never leaving hers. The girl remained still, staring at me with her empty, terrifying gaze. I turned and hurried towards the exit, clutching the book tightly. The oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of my footsteps echoing through the library. Then, suddenly, whispers grew louder, as if speaking directly into my ear, a mixture of voices seeming to come from everywhere. I looked around frantically but saw no one, and I couldn't determine their source. The library, once a sanctuary of knowledge, now felt like an abandoned house. As I fled, the whispers followed, growing more insistent. Panicking, I turned back, but the door had vanished, replaced by an endless corridor of bookshelves. The whispers were now deafening. I clutched the ancient book to my chest. I could see her clearly. The girl stood just inside the threshold, her black eyes sewn shut. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, as if cursing. Her face was grotesquely distorted, and she was holding a box containing something that looked like two eyes. I reached for the door and flung it open, the cold night air hitting me like a physical blow. As I made my way to the exit, I glanced back one last time. In the corner where the girl had stood, I saw a lock of blonde hair lying on the floor, glinting in the sunlight. The whispers had vanished, but the haunting feeling remained, a reminder that some secrets are better left undiscovered. I never spoke of what I saw that night. Sometimes, as I lay in bed, I was reminded not to mention the girl. She would scream, tears that couldn't fall because she had no eyes. If I spoke, she would be in danger for being exposed. Perhaps we had made a spiritual connection. She looked so pitiful. I didn't know what else to do but go to the church and pray for her. 2 months later, the dreams began to fade, and I rarely saw her in my sleep anymore. Perhaps it was a good thing for her. The weirdo at the pizza shop. I am a manager at a pizza shop. It was a typical Tuesday night at the place where I work. We were getting ready to wrap up for the night, and the last customers were finishing their meals. But then, the doorbell chimed, and Brad walked in, a customer everyone feared. He was a huge man, weighing hundreds of kilograms. As he entered, a foul stench began to fill the air in the shop. He shuffled over to a table in the corner and ordered a few of our largest deep dish pizzas. Tonight was no different, except for the small cooler he brought with him. He placed it on the table with a thud that echoed through the shop. I asked him, "What's in the cooler, Brad?" He grinned at me, revealing yellow teeth, and said it was just some sides he brought along. We don't really allow outside food to avoid any trouble, so I just told him not to make a mess. He took out his food and started eating. Even from where I was, it looked disturbing the way he ate. Even from that distance, I could hear the slurping, the chomping, the way he devoured the food like a man possessed. When I finally mustered the courage to bring out his first pizza, the stench hit me. It was emanating from his cooler, like something rotten. Inside the plastic bags were chunks of meat. I told him he couldn't eat, that it must have gone bad. Then he suddenly took out a grayish lump and started gnawing on it. With relish, it looked like raw meat. As the hours passed, things got more unsettling. He kept ordering pizza after pizza, his appetite seemingly insatiable. The few remaining customers fled in horror at the sight of Brad. For a brief moment, I thought he was finally done, but he wasn't. He motioned for me to come over, his face glistening with grease and sauce, making my skin crawl. He held up the bag of meat and asked for it to be warmed up. I stepped back, feeling uneasy, but agreed and put it on a tray. I hurried it over to the microwave. The stench filled the kitchen as the microwave started. When it beeped, I hesitated to open it, terrified of what I might find inside. As the steam cleared, I saw an unmistakable shape among the chunks of meat. It was a human ear, shriveled and grotesque. I panicked. I was about to call the police when I heard a scream from the dining area. I rushed out and found Nana, my assistant, clutching her arm, blood streaming down it. She was trembling with pain and fear, saying that Brad had bitten her. I looked over to where Brad had been sitting, and for some reason, he was lying on the floor amid a mess of leftover food. Brad was gasping for air. His shirt had torn open, and his belly was distended in a grotesque way. The buttons on his shirt were slowly popping open. He still tried to crawl toward another slice of pizza, but something was wrong. His belly was swelling, looking like it was about to burst. He collapsed, face first into the pizza, his body convulsing once before going still. His last words were, "So hungry," which sent everyone in the room screaming in terror. I called the police and asked them to handle the situation with Brad. His death was officially ruled as natural causes due to overeating, but I knew the truth. What he had been eating was likely far more horrifying. A lot happened all at once. My shop had to close for several days, and every time I think about it, I feel a chill of horror. The Stranger's Chase at Dunkin' Donut. It was just another regular shift at Dunkin', where I work part-time. The night shift is my usual shift, and tonight was no different. We usually close at 9 p.m., and I've grown used to the quiet that settles over the store as night falls. We had to clean up everything, and my coworker hadn't shown up yet, but that wasn't unusual. I was fine handling the store by myself. The inside of this Dunkin' was larger than most, with a few booths and tables scattered around. I had spent the last few hours in silence. No one had come in, and the last customer had left by 8:30 p.m. With only a few minutes left until closing, I walked around as usual, wiping down tables and making sure everything was tidy. As I passed by, heading back to the counter to clean up, something made my heart race. I hadn't noticed him before, but there was a man crouched down, almost hiding in the corner, completely out of sight from behind the counter. Everything seemed to freeze as his eyes locked with mine the moment I saw him. For a second, neither of us moved. The man slowly stood up. He was of average height, skinny, with messy hair and disheveled clothes. I asked him if he was okay, my voice trembling as I tried to stay calm. He didn't respond right away, mumbling that he was fine. I reminded him that we were closing and he needed to leave. He nodded and started walking toward the door. For a moment, I thought everything was fine, but then, without warning, He turned around and sprinted toward the counter with a crazed look on his face. Everything happened so fast. He didn't head for the door. He ran straight behind the counter, his eyes locked on the cash register. I began to realize what was happening. Without hesitation, I made for the exit, my mind racing. I didn't care about the cash register. I just needed to get out. Guys like him are dangerous, and they usually carry weapons. I had to be smart about this. But before I could reach the door, his voice rang out, loud and threatening. He shouted, his voice filled with anger. Stop. Froze for a second, but instinct kicked in, and I kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed the door open and ran out, without looking back. I thought he would be inside to rob the store, but I was wrong. He chased after me, running through the parking lot, and fear gripped me like never before. I looked around the area, but most of the stores were dark and closed. I spotted a gas station in the distance, its lights flickering like a beacon of hope. I ran faster, my breath quickening, and he was still behind me. The distance between us seemed to shrink. I burst into the gas station, my chest heaving with each breath. It was the closest place still open. As I ran inside, I shouted for someone to call the police. My voice was panicked and full of fear, echoing through the empty space. The clerk behind the counter and a lone customer turned to look at me. Startled, I ran past them, heading straight for the back of the store. A small restroom sign caught my attention. My fingers fumbled with the lock as I rushed inside. The flickering light in the small restroom, combined with the smell of bleach, heightened my tension. I was shaking uncontrollably. Leaning against the door, I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I reached into my pocket, my hands trembling as I pulled out my phone and called the police. The dispatcher reassured me that officers were on their way, but the minutes felt like hours as I waited. I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, listening for any sign of him. Nothing. The silence was suffocating. Was he following me? Was he out there, lurking? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong and that whatever awaited me outside wasn't over. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly unlocked the bathroom door and peeked outside. The gas station was eerily silent. The cashier was no longer behind the counter, and the customer had disappeared. I cautiously stepped out further. The dim lights cast long shadows over the shelves. I walked carefully, my own footsteps suddenly too loud. My eyes darted to the door, but there was no sign of the man outside. For a brief moment, a wave of relief washed over me. Then I saw him. Through the glass window, his face appeared pale and terrifying. His wild eyes pressed against the glass like something from a nightmare. His eyes locked onto mine, a twisted smile spreading across his face. He smiled grotesquely, almost stretching from ear to ear. Then he breathed onto the glass, writing the word "run." It felt like a challenge, daring me to try escaping. He slowly dragged his finger down the window, the screeching sound sending chills down my spine. He was waiting, like a predator, knowing that eventually I would have to come out. Panic surged within me again. I rushed toward the back exit, hoping it would lead to some way out. As I pushed the door open, I found myself outside again, this time in the alley behind the station. My breath fogged the cold air as I frantically looked around for somewhere to hide. The alley was narrow, with tall brick walls on either side, dark and unwelcoming. A few trash bins lined the path, but it was mostly empty. I had to make a choice. The only way out was forward or back to the gas station, where he might be waiting for me. I didn't have time to think. I started running, my body moving on instinct. As I ran, I glanced over my shoulder, nothing behind me. Still, fear gripped me tightly. This alley too dark, too unknown, leaving me vulnerable to whatever could come. I turned the corner and was met with a dead end. My heart sank as I saw the towering chain link fence blocking my way. I could hear my own breath, ragged and loud, and feel the cold sweat on my skin. Maybe there was no way out. Footsteps echoed behind me. Slow. Maybe he was coming closer. My body froze in place as the sound grew louder, the rhythm unsettling in its calmness. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. My back pressed against the cold brick wall as I realized I had no other choice but to face him. He appeared at the end of the alley, his eyes locked onto mine with that twisted smile. His steps slowed as he moved into the faint light, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the ground. In his hand, he held an iron rod. My heart was pounding in my chest. My legs were shaking. Then he spoke. "You can't run forever." His voice was low, mocking, and dragged the iron bar across the road with screeching sounds. My mind seemed to be spinning. I scanned the alley, desperately searching for anything that could help me. Without thinking, I grabbed a broken brick lying near the trash cans. I knew it wasn't enough to stop him, but I had no other choice. It was all I had. He stopped just inches from me, smirking. "You really think that's going to stop me?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. As he took one more step toward me, I swung the brick with all my strength. In the moment, he was too focused on taunting me. Turning away smugly, I threw the brick, and it hit him square in the head. For a second, everything froze. He staggered back, the smile vanishing from his face as blood trickled down his forehead. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I seized the moment and ran. I didn't look back. All I could think about was getting as far away as possible. The sound of sirens tore through the night air in the distance. The police were coming, but I didn't stop running. Right then, the screech of tires cut through the air as police cars appeared. 3 patrol cars pulled into the gas station, red and blue lights flashing furiously. I could see the officers jump out, guns drawn, moving with urgency. I tried to shout, trembling as I pointed toward the alley. "He's over there." The officer nodded quickly and signaled to the others. They disappeared into the alley, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they shouted commands. The man appeared at the mouth of the alley, running toward the parking lot. But this time he wasn't alone. The police were right behind him. His wild eyes darted in every direction as he desperately searched for a way out, but he was surrounded. The police quickly tackled him to the ground. The man struggled violently, his voice twisted with rage, sending chills down my spine. But now, I was truly safe. The flashing lights of the police cars began to fade as I sat on the cold sidewalk, trying to piece together everything that had happened. It was over, but the horror still lingered. The troublemaker at Starbucks. Lai had just graduated from college and found a temporary job, which left her struggling to find a place to live. Lai rented a small apartment near a Starbucks, where she worked as a barista. Starbucks was a hangout spot for local musicians and artists, the kind of crowd who knew their coffee. It stayed open until midnight, sometimes even later on weekends. Lai worked the night shift, a shift most employees weren't fond of. The pay was decent, though not great, but the shifts were quiet. However, there was always something unsettling about the empty cafe late at night, especially toward closing time. She spent most of her time cleaning and making coffee to keep herself busy. Nick, a friend of Lai's, would sometimes drop by to keep her company. He knew everyone who worked there. But one summer night, everything changed. Nick wasn't there that evening. He didn't show up because he was attending a friend's wedding, leaving Lai to face the night shift alone. By midnight, she had made only $10 in tips, and the store was almost entirely empty. But she felt grateful that she didn't have to deal with any difficult customers. She went to the back room to fill the mop bucket and started cleaning the floor. The silence was peaceful, but something felt off. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow pass by the front window. Lai glanced up, but no one was there. She called out, asking if anyone was there, thinking a customer had come in through the back door, but there was no response. After a moment of hesitation, she shrugged, thinking she had imagined it, and went back to cleaning behind the counter. Suddenly, she heard the bathroom door open. Lai's heart started pounding, and she felt uneasy. She hadn't seen anyone come in, and the store had been completely empty just minutes before. To her surprise, Nick walked out of the bathroom. A wave of relief washed over her, and she smiled, calling out,
Nick, what are you doing here?
He grinned back at her, saying he had just dropped by after the wedding, but something in his expression had changed. His usual friendly demeanor had turned into something unsettling. She gave an awkward smile, brushing off the strange feeling, and offered him a drink. As she started making an espresso, Lai glanced at him. He was staring at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. Lai tried to act normal and asked him what he was up to. Nick didn't respond. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket, a USB drive. His smile widened as he tossed it onto the counter. She stared at it, confused, asking what it was. Nick leaned in, lowering his voice to a whisper. He said he had recorded something Lai wouldn't want anyone else to see. She didn't understand what he was talking about. He stood up straight, crossing his arms. Nick threatened her about some private conversations she had with her boss. Panic started to rise in her, and she yelled that he was lying. Nick shook his head, his smile never fading. Her mind raced, trying to figure out if he was lying, but the confidence in his voice made it clear that he wasn't. He chuckled softly, stepping closer. He spoke to Lai with crude words. He had initially planned to blackmail her, but now he didn't need to, and he thought it was time for Lai to show some appreciation for all the nights he'd kept her company. A nauseating feeling rose in Lai's throat as she realized what he was implying. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest, screaming that he was insane and that she hadn't done anything. Nick's smile turned sinister. Her hands trembled, barely able to breathe as she tried to figure out how to escape. The store was closed, and the doors were locked. She was alone with him, and he was moving in, ready to corner her. She backed away and pleaded with him. His expression darkened, saying he had spent too much time helping without getting anything in return. He reached behind his back and pulled out a knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light. She glanced around the room, desperately searching for a way to escape. Her eyes landed on the espresso machine, and an idea formed in her mind. Lai tried to stall him and suggested making him a cup of coffee first. Nick raised an eyebrow but didn't object. She hurried behind the counter, her hands trembling as she poured an espresso. Her heart raced as she reached for the panini press. Without warning, Lai grabbed it and swung it at Nick's head with all her strength. The metal struck the side of his skull, and he staggered back, dropping the knife. Blood trickled down his face, and he let out a groan of pain. But the blow wasn't enough to bring him down. She needed to act fast. Lai ran around the counter, her eyes fixed on Nick as he wiped the blood from his face and started moving toward her. She frantically scanned the room for another weapon or an escape. Nick moved slowly, deliberately, as if he knew Lai had nowhere to run. His smile had vanished, replaced by a grim expression. She backed up toward the rear of the cafe, her mind racing to come up with a plan. The mop bucket was still near the back door. If only she could reach it. With trembling hands, she lunged for the mop bucket, grabbed the metal handle and swung it at him. Nick dodged the first blow, but she swung again, striking him in the ribs. He groaned in pain, stumbling backward. She didn't stop. She swung again, this time aiming for his legs. It sent Nick crashing to the ground with a pained yell, clutching his knee. She seized the opportunity and ran for the back door. Lai fumbled with the lock as Nick struggled to get up. She finally managed to open the door and dashed out into the alley behind the store. She kept running, too afraid to look back as she heard Nick's footsteps behind her. He was limping, but he was still chasing her. Lai rounded a corner and spotted a large metal dumpster near the end of the alley. She crouched behind it, holding her breath. Her heart was pounding so fast it felt like it might burst out of her chest. From her hiding spot, she heard Nick stumble into the alley. His breathing was heavy, labored from the pain, and then his bitter voice called out, asking where she was, saying it wasn't over yet. Lai covered her mouth with her hand, trying to stay as silent as possible, not daring to move. Suddenly, she heard a faint sound, the wail of sirens in the distance. Maybe someone had heard the commotion and called the police. Nick began limping back toward the Starbucks, his footsteps growing fainter as he disappeared into the night. Her legs were shaking so much, she could barely stand. She knew she had to leave before he came back. As she stumbled onto the street, she saw the flashing lights of a police car approaching. Lai felt a wave of relief and waved for help. A short time later, Lai was brought to the interrogation room at the police station. The officers came in and told her that Nick had been arrested. He had been hiding in the cafe, trying to erase the security footage. The relief was immense. It was finally over. Nick had been arrested, and the evidence against him was undeniable. He would be charged with multiple crimes, including assault and attempted blackmail. The nightmare was over, and Nick would pay for everything he had done. Mysterious invitation in the basement. The warm afternoon sun spread across the school campus as the students left for the day. I remember it like it was yesterday. Everything seemed normal, but there was something different about that week. That was the week Justin arrived. He was a new student, showing up in the middle of the semester without warning. He was quiet, maybe a little strange, but friendly enough. He sat next to me in class because there happened to be an empty seat, and soon enough, we started talking. Justin always seemed distant, like he was hiding something and rarely talked about himself. He just said he had recently moved to our town. There was something odd about him, but I brushed it aside. I thought everyone had their quirks. A few weeks later, he invited me over to his house. I was a bit surprised by this. He told me to come around 7 p.m. I wasn't particularly excited, but I agreed. After all, he was new to town, and I thought he could use a friend. That night, I took a bus to his neighborhood and started walking to find Justin's house. His home was in a rundown area. The houses were small, and the streets were eerily quiet. The porch light was off when I arrived, and the windows were dark. I texted Justin to let him know I was there. After a minute with no reply, I moved closer to the front door. It was unlocked. I paused for a moment, then pushed the door open. Inside, it was almost pitch black. The house was silent, except for a faint noise coming from somewhere deep inside. I stood at the entrance, calling out for Justin, but there was no answer. My phone buzzed, and finally, he responded, "Come in. I'm in the basement." I went down the basement stairs. The sound of a TV or video game echoed from the basement. The basement door was slightly ajar, and the noise grew louder as I approached. I figured Justin was playing something. The basement was darker than the rest of the house, with just a faint light flickering. As I descended, the sounds of gunfire and explosions became clearer, but something felt wrong. I called out to Justin again, but the only answer I got was the echo of my own voice. At the bottom of the stairs, I hesitated. It was pitch black, except for the flicker of a TV somewhere in the distance. I moved forward, inching through the darkness, toward the faint light. I called out again, louder this time, "Justin," but still nothing. Suddenly, I felt it. A hard shove from behind. I stumbled and hit the ground face first. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I lay there for a moment, stunned. Laughter echoed through the basement. I staggered to my feet, my heart racing. I turned, trying to see who had pushed me, but the darkness swallowed everything. Then came another shove, harder this time, sending me sprawling to the floor again. The laughter started up once more. It felt like I was being toyed with. Panic hit me. My legs were trembling. Someone kicked my legs as I tried to stand, knocking me down again. I had to get out now. I sprinted toward the stairs, my feet slipping on the slick concrete floor. My heart pounded in my chest. Footsteps echoed behind me, and the laughter still rang in my ears. My hands fumbled in the dark, desperately searching for the railing. My foot caught on the bottom step, and I stumbled, but I managed to catch myself. I burst through the front door and ran. When I got home, I texted Justin, wanting to know what the hell had just happened, but he never responded. The next day at school, I expected him to show up and either laugh it off or offer an explanation. But Justin didn't say a word. He sat there, silent, avoiding my gaze. Then, one Monday, he was gone. His desk was empty, with no books or belongings. There were rumors that he had moved away, but no one seemed to care. But I did. I couldn't stop thinking about that night. In my mind, I kept replaying the moment I was shoved and the laughter that followed me. It felt like I was being hunted. I still wondered if it had been Justin or someone else down there with me. And then I remembered something I had overlooked in the chaos. When I first entered the basement, there were more footsteps than just mine. I didn't dare go back to Justin's house after that day. I'm glad I escaped that house. I know that some mysteries are better left unsolved and without knowing, but the questions I wonder still haunt me and push me to find them. I don't know if I should. Mysterious invitation in the basement. It's been weeks since Justin disappeared. Despite my best efforts to move on, my mind kept going back to that basement. The laughter, the shoves, the darkness. No matter how hard I tried to push it away, it haunted me. There was a nagging feeling inside me I needed answers. Tonight, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, and a message was sent. It seemed like spam. Hey Ken, long time no see. Just remember to stay away from it. I didn't know what the warning was about, or what I was supposed to stay away from. But my mind kept repeating, could it be Justin? I couldn't keep living with this fear. If Justin had any answers, I was going to get them tonight. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. Justin's house looked just as it had when I left it, dark and unsettling. The eerie silence of the neighborhood made me anxious. The front door was ajar, just like before. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was quiet, and my footsteps echoed through the empty space, each step sending chills down my spine. The fear I had felt weeks ago crept back in. I cautiously headed straight for the basement. The door was wide open. The stairs creaked beneath me as I descended into the pitch-black void. I gripped my phone tightly, using its light to guide me, but the beam barely cut through the suffocating darkness. The temperature dropped as I moved deeper inside. Slowly, I saw it something I had missed before. In the faint glow of my phone, I noticed strange symbols carved into the walls, jagged and confusing like runes. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught my attention. I swept my phone around, and there, at the far end of the basement, I saw him, Justin. He stood still, his face pale, eyes wide, lifeless and empty, staring straight at me. My voice caught in my throat as I called his name. Justin? He didn't respond. He didn't move. Whether it was my eyes or the darkness, he seemed half visible, almost translucent in the dim light of my phone. like he wasn't even there. I cautiously moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and then the whispering began. It started small, unintelligible, but grew louder. Fear crept in. He was muttering something in a language I couldn't understand, then told me,
"You shouldn't have come back."
Suddenly, my mind was flooded with images. I wasn't in the present anymore. I was seeing something from years ago. I saw Justin standing in the basement with his strange mother. They stood around a table covered with old books and candles. Justin seemed forced into it, his face filled with fear and resignation. The candles flickered, and suddenly, Justin froze. He stared at something in the shadows. A figure slowly emerged with eyes burning like fire. The figure reached out, and in a flash, everything stopped. I was back in the present, gasping for air. I stepped back, my eyes scanning the basement. Justin's body twitched, his mouth curling into a grotesque, twisted smile as he said,
"It never left. It's been waiting for you."
I tried to move, but I couldn't. The ground beneath me trembled, and I felt invisible, icy hands pulling me down. But just as I was about to be swallowed by some unseen darkness, I saw Justin, his real face. It was different from before. He looked pitiful, as if he were trapped. He whispered faintly,
"Help me, please."
In that moment, it hit me, had Justin never left the basement? Had he been trapped here all this time? I screamed his name, Justin, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The last thing I heard was the basement door slamming shut above me, locking us inside. Then I opened my eyes. I woke up, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. I was in my bed, in my room, with the faint light of dawn creeping through the window. It felt like hours had passed, but when I glanced at the clock, only a few minutes had gone by. I had no idea when I had fallen, asleep. For a moment, I thought it was just a nightmare, but it felt too real. It made me think about the questions I had sought answers for, but that dream made me stop. Was it a warning to keep me away from all of it? I think I will never go back there again. The outcome of the Hitchhiker Man. I was working the third shift at a 24/7 diner in a quiet town. Most of our customers were truck drivers and travelers passing through. But the strangest people I've ever met were the drifters, addicts, and hitchhikers. That night started like any other. Carl, the cook, had been working at this place for over 15 years, and he had seen it all. His sharp eyes could spot trouble from a mile away. We were perfectly in sync. I served tables, and he flipped burgers. No, with a new cast in the pipeline, and he flipped burgers. Around 4 a.m., the shift was well underway. The place was completely silent, not a single person in sight. The only sound breaking the silence was the hum of the old refrigerator. Suddenly, the door creaked open. A man stumbled in, clutching his right arm to his chest. He didn't say a word, just shuffled past Carl and me, heading straight to the bathroom. His clothes were torn and filthy, and his face was twisted in pain. Carl and I exchanged glances. We'd seen strange customers before, but there was something off about this guy, more than just a regular drifter. I asked Carl, "Doesn't he look familiar?" After a moment, I remembered. That guy had come in before, begging for food and a ride. We had to kick him out because he was bothering the customers. But now, something had changed. He looked panicked, like he had seen something terrifying. Carl just shook his head, muttering, "Here we go again." I looked at the bathroom door. I didn't want to check on him, but I didn't have much choice. Carl handed me the keys, nodding toward the bathroom. "Go check if he's all right." I knocked on the door, asking if he needed help, but there was no response. I knocked again, harder this time. Still, nothing. I called out, fumbling with the keys. I pushed the door open, saying I was coming in. The bathroom was empty. No trace of the man. No dirt, no blood, nothing. The bathroom was as clean as the night before. I froze at the doorway. End and year and ye and Andra. I screamed for Carl. He rushed over. I backed away as he pushed past me, staring into the spotless room with wide, disbelieving eyes. We stood behind the counter, both of us trying to make sense of what had just happened. How could he have disappeared? I looked at Carl, but he had the same horrified expression as I did. Then I saw movement near the front window. The man was outside, staring at us. His face was worse than before, bloody, swollen, and his eyes were bleeding. But what froze me in place was how his right hand hung limply at his side, looking like it was about to snap off. His thumb was sticking straight up, unnaturally stiff, as if he was trying to hitch a ride. Before I could grab the phone to call 911, a loud noise echoed from the back of the diner. Carl and I rushed to the back. It was coming from the freezer. Someone was tearing into the food boxes. Carl grabbed a knife from the counter, and we slowly moved in. The man was inside, tearing open a box of frozen meatballs and pressing a pile of meat against his arm, like he was possessed. But his arm, it wasn't right. His hand was dangling, almost detached from his wrist. For a moment, everything went still. We locked eyes on him, witnessing something we couldn't believe. Then, at an unnatural speed, he bolted past us, kicked the kitchen door open, and ran outside. Carl and I stood there, too shocked to react. We had just witnessed the impossible. Carl hurried to the front, locked the diner doors, and turned off the lights, plunging the place into darkness. The only light now came from the neon sign outside, casting a dim red glow on the counter. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, my hands trembling. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. That man, if he was really injured, was moving with an unnatural speed and strength. And those eyes, it was like something else was controlling him. When I looked out the window, the parking lot was empty. There was no sign of the man. Carl stood with me, his face tense, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. I asked Carl what we should do now, and if we should call the police. Carl shook his head and said they wouldn't believe us, and there was no way to explain this. He reconsidered, slowly walking to the phone and picking up the receiver. But just as he dialed 911, the lights in the diner flickered. The hum of the refrigerator went silent, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, in the darkness, we heard a soft, slow tapping on the window. We bolted through the kitchen, with Carl leading the way. I glanced back just in time to see the glass shatter, and the man crawling through the window like a wild animal. Carl pushed open the back door, and we stumbled out into the alley behind the diner. Carl panted, glancing around. We need to get to the car. We sprinted down the alley, the man's footsteps echoing behind us. He was faster than I expected, his heavy breathing growing louder as he closed in on us. I could hear his raspy voice muttering something, words I couldn't quite make out. Carl reached the car, fumbling with the keys, urging me to get in quickly as the doors unlocked. I yanked the door open and jumped inside just as Carl started the engine. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the man standing at the end of the alley. Now he was covered in blood, his smile wider as he slowly raised his thumb again, rigid and grotesque, like a hitchhiker's signal. Tires screeched as Carl slammed on the gas, and the truck sped out of the alley and onto the road. I glanced into the rear-view mirror, my heart still racing. The man stood motionless at the edge of the diner, watching us disappear into the night. We didn't speak for the first few miles, both of us too stunned to process what had just happened. We drove in silence for the next hour, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and that place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I eventually called the police to report the incident. To my surprise, they told us to head toward a location near the diner. They confirmed that a man matching that description had been reported. A man had been killed in a hit and run accident near the ramp, not far from the diner. As I got closer, I saw it. It was the same man. His body lay by the roadside, his clothes covered in dirt. But the eeriest part was his right hand, still holding that thumb up, just like before. According to the report, the man had survived the initial accident earlier that night and had been able to walk. His desperate search for help led him to our diner before he collapsed on the road. But there was more to the story. It turned out that this man had been involved in a series of violent incidents years earlier, hitchhiking across states and attacking those who picked him up. The police pieced together his history, a fugitive, infamous for attacking victims and vanishing into the night. The accident had broken his body, but it didn't kill him immediately. He had stumbled into the diner, seeking refuge, only to return to the streets, where he was eventually found dead. The police said he had been trying to use his injury to manipulate others. We were lucky to have escaped him. As I stood in the parking lot, staring at the diner, everything started to make sense. The man wasn't a ghost. He was real. Maybe he had finally paid the price in the same way he had hurt others on the road. That was where his twisted journey had come to an end. Pharmacy obsession. It was a quiet evening. Lily had been working as a pharmacy technician for a few years. It was a simple job, filling prescriptions and dispensing medications. The pharmacy had its regular customers. Some were friendly, while others were a bit odd, but everyone got used to them. Joe was one of those regulars, a man in his mid-30s who came by often. He stood out with his long, disheveled hair and eccentric clothing. Lily had seen Joe and his elderly mother many times. She was always his caretaker, bringing Joe in to get his medication. The mix of drugs he needed included antipsychotics, antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds, and a type of medicine for infectious diseases. Joe always complimented Lily and called her Kitty because she wore a pink bow hair clip. It was harmless, though strange. Lily would politely smile, chat, and give him his medication. He never made her feel unsafe. One day, Joe's mother came alone. She looked tired, older than before. She told them that Joe wasn't well. He had stopped taking his antipsychotic medication and was becoming unpredictable, sometimes even aggressive. She could no longer control him. The court had declared Joe unfit to make decisions, so he was admitted to a mental health facility. Lily felt a bit sad, missing the familiar face, but relieved knowing Joe was being taken care of. For months, they didn't see Joe. The facility's staff regularly picked up his prescriptions, and life at the pharmacy went on as usual. Then, one Friday night, everything changed. It was late. Only she and another female colleague were working. The store was quiet, as it often was on Friday nights. Lily was reading a magazine at the counter. Then, she heard a voice.
Hey, Kitty.
At first, she didn't look up. After all, she wasn't Kitty, and she figured someone in the store was talking. But then the voice came again, angrier this time.
Kitty!
Suddenly, a bloodied hand slammed onto the counter in front of Lily, startling her. It was Joe, but something was wrong. He was bleeding heavily. The counter was smeared with Joe's bloody handprint. His face was pale, his eyes wild, like he had lost his mind. Her heart raced, and she slowly backed away from him. Lily's colleague, Jane, hurried over, concerned, asking what Joe was doing there since his medication had already been picked up on Tuesday. Joe didn't answer. He just kept staring at Lily, his voice soft but filled with dangerous intensity. He said he wanted to see Kitty and that he missed her. He started moving toward the waist-high door that separated the pharmacy counter from the rest of the store. Panic rose in Lily. Jane tried to calm him down, but Joe kept repeating the same demand, saying he wanted to see Kitty and telling Lily to come closer. She shook her head, fear rising inside her. She refused Joe, saying she couldn't come closer, but he didn't stop, beginning to cry and then scream. He started climbing over the counter, his bloody hands gripping the edge, leaving deep red stains on the white surface. Jane realized things were getting out of control and told Lily to hide in the storage room. Lily slammed the door shut and locked it, listening as Joe's voice turned into full-blown screams. He was throwing things all over the store in a frenzy, grabbing whatever he could reach. Blood spattered over bottles and shelves. Jane called the store manager and quickly phoned the police. Through the crack of the door, Lily could see the chaos. A few customers had gathered, staring in shock. One of them moved as if they were about to intervene. Both Lily and Jane shouted together,
Don't touch him!
because Joe had an infectious disease, and his blood was everywhere. Anyone who touched him would be at risk of infection. The police arrived quickly, but didn't rush in. They were wearing full protective gear, gloves, masks, and all because of Joe's blood. They cautiously approached him. At first, he resisted, screaming for Lily. But finally, the police managed to sneak behind him and sedate him. Joe collapsed to the floor, unconscious, and his bloody rampage was over. The store had to be closed. A specialized cleaning crew came to disinfect everything. A few days later, after the store reopened, Joe's mother came by to apologize. Joe was then transferred to a higher security facility where he would be more closely monitored. The smell of blood and the fear still lingered in Lily's memory. She hadn't seen Joe since that night. She heard that Joe's mother had considered suing the care facility for negligence, but she didn't follow up on what happened next. She just continued her work, but she would never forget him.